technical remarks, but I would recall just 2 points. If you would like to take the floor, please send a message through the chat function. Switch on translation to listen speakers only when you actually need it. Otherwise, we will lose sound quality. And now, without further ado, let me introduce for the opening remarks His Excellency, the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of Portugal, Mr. Augusto Santos Silva. Your Excellency, dear Minister, the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great pleasure to open the International Conference on the Death Penalty, and I would like to thank the Portuguese Permanent Representation to the OSCE for this very timely initiative. This conference is one of the highlights of the program of the Portuguese Presidency of the Council of the European Union. It testifies Portugal's engagement in the OSCE and its commitment to the abolition of the death penalty. As you perhaps know, Portugal was more than 150 years ago one of the first countries in the world to abolish the death penalty for civil crimes. We take a great pride in this achievement and we feel the duty to honor it. That's why we firmly oppose the death penalty at all times and in all circumstances. We have ratified all international instruments to that effect, both in our national capacity and as the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. Putting an end to capital punishment is for Portugal of the utmost importance. We remain actively committed to its abolition worldwide. As stated in the most recent EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, this is an EU human rights priority. It must be a global one as well. Albert Camus once wrote, capital punishment is the most premeditated of murders. The death penalty is indeed a cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishment. It is immoral, it is irreversible, it runs counter to the inherent dignity of the human person. It violates the right to life enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But the death penalty is also ineffective. It is not a deterrent to criminals. It has no restorative effect on victims, and it does not contribute to public safety and security. We must therefore move from punitive to restorative criminal justice. Many studies, among them the background paper of the ODR of OSCE, have shown that death penalty sentences can be arbitrary and socially biased, as they disproportionately affect persons in vulnerable situations who sometimes do not have access to adequate defense mechanisms. The social stigma and psychological trauma endured by the families of death row prisoners has also been highlighted. Over the last years, the abolitionist trend has been consistently growing, with an increasing majority of countries removing it from their criminal code or not carrying out executions for a long time. Last year, the record of execution was the lowest in more than a decade. Newly imposed death sentences decreased significantly, and some countries took decisive steps to abolish this cruel punishment. I thank them for that. However, we cannot take this trend as granted. in some parts of the world, executions have resumed or even increased. There are still supporters of the capital punishment worldwide. If we want to ensure that the abolitionist trend continues, we must take swift and coordinated action whenever possible, especially in international and regional fora, namely the UN, the Council of Europe, the European Union, and of course, the OECD, the OSCE. We must be willing to strengthen partnerships and to improve outreach to retentionist countries, engaging them through dialogue to promote the introduction of moratoria on executions as a first step towards abolition, and to assist them in overcoming the obstacles to that end. Ladies and gentlemen, eradicating the death penalty is an all-of-society endeavor at global scale. Every country and each international organization have a role to play. The OSCE participant states undertook a commitment in the Vienna and Copenhagen documents and subsequent OSCE documents to keep the abolition of capital punishment in our agenda. It is paramount that we strive to raise public awareness and foster debate on the abolition of death penalty among NGOs, civil society, academia, lawyers, human rights activists, and other experts. The abolition of capital punishment has featured repeatedly in the agendas of our Permanent Council, where Portugal is the EU chef de file, and in the recommendations of our ODIHR Human Dimension Implementation meetings. In the words of the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, the death penalty has no place in the 21st century. I call upon the countries that have not yet acceded to the relevant UN and Council of Europe conventions and protocols to do so without delay. I invite you to consider supporting other international initiatives and independent structures devoted to the abolition of the death penalty, such as the International Commission Against the Death Penalty, of which Portugal was a co-founder. I hope that in the near future, our organization may become a death penalty-free region and serve as an inspiration for the whole world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister Santos Silva, for your very thoughtful speech, setting the scene for what we hope it will be a fruitful discussion. We now move to section 1, focusing on the role of multilateral organizations on the death penalty issue. And I have the honor to welcome our first guest speaker of this session, the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights, Mr. Eamon Gilmore. Mr. Gilmore has a vast experience in international affairs, having previously held the office of Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade of Ireland. In that capacity, Mr. Gilmore was also chair of the OSCE during the Irish chairpersonship in 2013. Mr. Gilmore, welcome back to Vienna. It's with pleasure that I pass to you the screen. Please.
Dear Minister, Chairperson, Excellencies, distinguished guests and speakers. Firstly, I wish to thank Minister Augusto Santos Silva and the Portuguese Presidency of the EU for organising today's international conference and for the honour to speak here at the OSCE. And I wish to take the opportunity also to congratulate Portugal on its excellent presidency of the Council of the European Union. 154 years ago, Portugal was the first sovereign nation in Europe to cease capital punishment and also one of the first in the world to do so. Ever since, Portugal has played a leading role in promoting the total abolition of the death penalty around the globe. And this conference will be a major contribution to that effort. As the Minister said, Portugal is, of course, chef de file on the death penalty amongst the EU member states in the Council of Europe. But Portugal is leading above all by example. As one of the pioneering countries to abolish the death penalty, Portugal is a showcase that the death penalty is unnecessary. According to the global think tank, Institute for Economics and Peace, Portugal is third in the world ranking of the most peaceful and safe countries today and among the most visited countries in the world. Here today, I wish to reaffirm the European Union's position of unambiguous, strong, and absolute opposition to capital punishment in all cases and under any circumstances. The death penalty is a cruel and inhumane punishment which fails to deter criminal behavior and which represents an unacceptable denial of human dignity and integrity. State-sponsored killings are against the principle that one shall not kill. We all want less criminality and safer societies, but it is not with executions that we promote less violence and safer societies. Let me address three of the arguments we often hear. Deterrence is probably the most commonly heard rationale. There is, however, no credible evidence that the death penalty deters crime more than other forms of punishment. It is the certainty of punishment rather than its severity which deters crime. Another argument is that of public opinion being in favor of retaining capital punishment. The inconsistency with this argument is that it is particularly used by countries with limited civil society space and media freedom. Very few retentionist countries share information, and in the absence of objective information, how can there be an informed debate? Thirdly, it is also argued that states have the sovereign right to determine their criminal justice systems and that capital punishment is not prohibited under international law. What we see in practice, though, is that often people are being sentenced to death on discriminatory grounds or for specific forms of behavior that should not be criminalized in the first place, for having expressed an opinion or established a political group or for being a member of the various sexual and religious minority groups. The abolition of the death penalty is not a matter of culture or tradition. It is primarily a question of political will. In 2020, 89% of the executions took place in just 4 countries, excluding China, where the number of executions is a state secret, but where there are reasonable reasons to believe that the figure is above 1,000 per year. The 4 countries were Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, where only last week 17 prisoners were executed. But steady progress is being made. Today we are witnessing a global trend to abandon this inhumane punishment. Over the last 10 years, no executions took place in 162 member states of the United Nations, which represents 84% of the total number. And if we look only at last year, 2020, a record high of 176 countries did not execute anyone. This means that there were no executions last year in 91% of the 193 UN member states. Each year, new steps are taken and new countries join a world free of the death penalty. This year, and we are only yet in May, we have already 2 abolitions in Malawi and Africa and the state of Virginia in the United States. Moreover, 2 new countries have ratified the second optional protocol about the abolition of the death penalty, Armenia and Kazakhstan. Besides the abolition in Virginia this year, a broader progress is happening in the USA. In the last 4 years, 4 states abolished the death penalty: Washington, New Hampshire, Colorado, and Virginia. There are already 36 states in the US that either abolished in law or stopped using the death penalty for a long period, representing almost 3/4 of the number of US states. These developments show that the international trend is towards universal abolition. Justice systems are run by humans and are therefore naturally exposed to mistakes, aggravated by influences, social stigma, and political pressures, particularly so in countries with no real independent justice system and no functioning system of checks and balances. In addition, defendants who do not have good lawyers to question the prosecutor allegations are more at risk of ending up on death row and being executed. The death penalty is tainted by a number of biases. I will mention two, but there are many more. The best known is racial discrimination. Numerous studies, including from the American Academy for Political and Social Science, have shown that white victim homicides, especially in cases in which minorities are accused of killing whites, are much more likely to result in death sentences than in other cases. A less mentioned bias is gender discrimination. Although women represent a small percentage of death penalty sentences, women are sentenced to death at higher rates than men for certain categories of crime, such as those related to sexual morality. Moreover, mitigating circumstances relating to domestic violence and abuse are rarely taken into consideration during the investigation. The European Union has a strong and unequivocal opposition to the death penalty in all times and in all circumstances, and the EU will continue its long-standing campaign against the death penalty. We deplore death sentences and executions of minors, of people with mental or intellectual disabilities, and death sentences imposed after proceedings that did not meet international fair trial standards or based on confessions extracted through torture. Fighting death penalty is a priority in the European Union's external human rights policy. The EU uses its political and diplomatic weight, financial support, and technical and human rights instruments to encourage the remaining countries to join the abolitionist ranks, or at the very least, to respect international minimum standards. To streamline and strengthen all our efforts to fight the death penalty across the world, the EU Council adopted EU guidelines on the death penalty more than 20 years ago in 1998. Through our regular human rights dialogues with partner countries, we monitor closely and encourage measures and initiatives taken towards the abolition of the death penalty. In this context, and through the recent bilateral engagements, I have highlighted this subject with our partners and my meetings relating to Bahrain, Belarus, India, Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Vietnam, and with the United States, to mention but a few. The new EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, 2020 to 24, which was agreed by all 27 member states in November last year, includes this objective: to work towards the worldwide abolition of the death penalty, and in countries where the death penalty still exists, to insist on the respect of minimum standards and to work towards a moratorium on executions as a first step towards abolition. In our trade policy, we have adopted legislation that prohibits trade in goods that can be used for torture or execution. Such goods include barbiturate agents used in lethal injections for the execution of human beings. In 2017, together with Argentina and Mongolia, we launched the new Alliance for Torture-Free Trade, aimed at bringing together countries from around the world to end the trade in goods used for capital punishment and torture globally. The European Union also uses its trade policy to encourage countries who are beneficiaries of the general system of preferences to ratify and comply with a range of international conventions, including the conventions which relate to the death penalty. In addition, through the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, we support the work of civil society organizations worldwide, contributing to training of judiciary, public awareness raising, the creation of national networks, the monitoring of the use of the death penalty, and advocacy for legal reform and dialogue. And it is good to have the well-respected Ecpm with us today to announce the date for the World Congress Against the Death Penalty. You can count on the EU's support. For the few governments that still persist in the use of the death penalty, the EU calls for compliance with international standards that protect vulnerable people, ensure fair trials, and restrict the use of the death penalty. But only abolition will effectively terminate the unjust and cruel effect of the death penalty. For all the reasons I have just mentioned, and that today's discussion will further highlight, all remaining governments should consider supporting the EU resolution and declaring a moratorium on executions as a first step leading to abolition. The world is moving gradually towards the complete abolition of the death penalty. In almost 92% of the countries of the world, there was no execution at all last year. In others, the offences justifying the death penalty are being restricted and the execution of minors is being ended. These are positive steps which bring the world closer to a complete abolition. This is an achievable objective. This is therefore a moment when we should all redouble our efforts to finish the journey to a world where the death penalty is consigned to history. As Secretary General Guterres has said, the death penalty has no place in the 21st century. Our challenge now is to achieve abolition as early as possible in this 21st century. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Mr. Gilmore. And let me now pass the floor to the next speaker, well known here at OSCE and appointed in December 2020. Mr. Matteo Mecacci is the director of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Mr. Mecacci has an extensive knowledge of the death penalty issues and has served as member of the Italian Parliament and at the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE. Dear Matteo, welcome, and the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me congratulate the Portuguese EU presidency for organizing this important conference. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to reflect on multilateral efforts to abolish the death penalty in such a high-level meeting. In Helsinki, back in 2008, OSCE participating states stressed that, and I quote, "Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person," end of quote. In line with these words, today we register a growing international consensus viewing the death penalty as a form of punishment that cannot be fully reconciled with the right to life. For several years, I was personally involved in efforts to limit the use of the death penalty at the international level. In fact, as a representative of civil society, I was proud to be part of a global campaign, together actually with you, Ambassador Lobo de Mesquita, who were in Washington, in New York at the time, that led to the approval in 2007 of the first UN General Assembly resolution calling for a global moratorium of the death penalty towards its abolition, a campaign where the EU and Italy played an important role. Since then, more progress has been made internationally and more states have limited or completely abolished the capital punishment. Looking at our OSCE region, this year alone, we welcome the positive news that both Kazakhstan and the US state of Virginia have successfully abolished the death penalty. As of today, all but 2 OSCE participating states have abolished the capital punishment. The importance of acting internationally was also the view of late Professor Christoph Heinz, about whose passing we sadly learned earlier this year. One of the most vigorous advocates against capital punishment in his role as UN Special Rapporteur, he was tireless and skilled in enunciating the shrinking foothold in international law for the death penalty. Today, we honor his memory by building on his legacy. OSCE participating states have made a number of commitments regarding the death penalty, including keeping the question of capital punishment under consideration, exchanging information on the question of the abolition of the death penalty, and providing information on the use of the death penalty to the public. Participating states have also committed to ensuring that no one shall be subject to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, and to take effective legislative, judicial, and other measures to prevent and punish such practices. In accordance with these commitments and its mandate, the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, monitors trends and developments and presents a background paper on the death penalty in the OSCE area each year. It raises awareness about the application of capital punishment in the OSCE region and how participating states are contributing to the global abolitionist trend. As I've mentioned, there are only 2 states in the OSCE region who still carry out executions, the United States and Belarus. You may already be familiar with the many compelling facts and human rights standards that underpin the calls to abandon capital punishment, but it is important not to lose sight of that. Firstly, let's keep in mind that the death penalty is a form of retribution that involves a system by which a state institution organizes the killing of a human being. Different methods of execution are used, but all studies, both from a medical and a human rights standpoint, tell us that it is practically impossible to carry out execution without violating the prohibition of torture or other ill treatments. The use of certain drugs in lethal injections like pentobarbital which was used for the recent federal executions and that we have just learned may be planned to be used again in Arizona, causes pain and suffering that could amount to torture. In some cases, prisoners have requested to be executed by firing squad, electrocution, or nitrogen asphyxiation because of widespread reports of the pain endured from a 3-drug lethal injection which has not been tested. Secondly, people who do not have the capacity to comprehend their actions are in some cases still subjected to the death penalty. This includes people with mental disabilities, and it is particularly troubling to sentence to death individuals with psychological or intellectual disabilities who face considerable barriers in defending themselves. Thirdly, the analysis of death sentences handed down show the discriminatory nature of the death penalty. The poor and economically vulnerable members of ethnic, racial, or religious minorities and other marginalized members of society are overrepresented on death rows all around the world. Numerous challenges are also faced by women in the criminal justice system. As noted in our 2020 background paper, women on death row often share a common set of characteristics. They come from marginalized environments scarred by abuse, violence, and economic dependence. And research indicates that women offenders may receive harsher sentences than men for violent offenses due to the breach of their traditionally perceived role in societies. Fourthly, unfortunately, many cases that end in the death penalty lack basic elements of a fair trial, like the presumption of innocence or effective defense counsel. Inability to afford legal representation can literally endanger the life of a human being in processes that are fraught with doubt and error. But miscarriages of justice are irreversible in capital cases, and therefore states bear a greater responsibility when they sentence someone to death. I would finally like to draw attention to the unnecessary secrecy and uncertainty surrounding executions, including the refusal to provide advance notice of the date and time of execution to convicted persons and their family members. This can also result in inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. It is not surprising that in light of all these arguments, intergovernmental organizations that have taken now clear stances toward the abolition of the death penalty, amongst them the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and the EU, as we just heard. We also take note that these organizations call on states to restrict the import, export, and transfer of goods used for capital punishment and torture or other ill treatment. This exemplifies the increasing preoccupation that enabling other states to carry out executions could amount to cruel punishment. Motivated by all these compelling reasons, let's take inspiration from how the abolition of the death penalty was achieved in various jurisdictions in the past in the OSCE region. And in fact, in our 2021 background paper, we plan to reflect on some key factors that have influenced pathways to the abolition of capital punishment in several illustrative jurisdictions: Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Latvia, and the US state of Virginia. Looking at factors such as legal processes, political contents, and public opinion, it is evident that the road to abolition is often not linear and can be achieved in various ways. But political leadership, multilateral efforts, the work of civil society and international organizations, as well as religious groups and victim families, are common denominators. The importance of the existence of broad coalitions cannot be overstated. On this note, let me acknowledge the efforts of the many national and international civil society organizations who tirelessly advocate to limit capital executions, report on its use, and provide legal assistance for those on death row. Retention of the death penalty is often defended as satisfying the desire of victim families for justice. However, this is a widely held misconception, as there are also family members of murder victims who effectively make a very strong case not for, but against capital punishment. Let me therefore conclude my remarks with the words succinctly and powerfully expressed by members of the murder victims' families for reconciliation: that the state must not kill in their names. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your valuable input, Mr. McCarthy. And let me now pass the floor to the last keynote speaker of this first session, Mr. Christos Iakomopoulos was appointed Director General of Human Rights and Rule of Law of the Council of Europe in 2017, having previously held the position of Director of Human Rights. Between 2006 and 2011, he was the Director of Monitoring in the same Directorate General. Mr. Iakomopoulos, is an honor to have two experts as yourself in this panel. Please, the screen is yours.
Dear Minister Santos Silva, dear Ambassador Lobo Mesquita, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me first of all join the previous speakers and congratulate Portugal for its pioneering role in the promotion of the abolition of death penalty worldwide, and for organizing this conference. It is important to keep this topic high on the agenda of international organizations and member states, as those who are gathered today around this conference. The Council of Europe and its 47 member states have created a death penalty-free zone for nearly a quarter of a century since the last execution in 1997. It is not exaggerated to say that abolition of the death penalty has become today part of the European acquis. The prohibition of death penalty has also been a precondition for membership to the Council of Europe since the 90s, and any attempt to reintroduce the death penalty would have immediate consequences on the country's status vis-à-vis the organization of the Council of Europe. How did we get there? The death penalty-free zone that is Europe today, with the exception of Belarus, looked quite different 70 years ago. 70 years ago, the death penalty was not considered to violate international standards. However, from the 1960s, a consensus began to emerge that the death penalty served no purpose in a civilized society governed by the rule of law and respect for human rights. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe played a leading role in this respect. It moved towards the abolition by confirming in a momentous debate in 1980 that the death penalty is inhuman. This led the Council of Europe to adopting in 1983 the first legally binding instrument providing for the unconditional abolition of death penalty in peacetime, that is Protocol number 6 to the European Convention of Human Rights. And this text is today ratified by 46 out of the 47 member states of the Council of Europe. The Russian Federation, which is the remaining state, is committed to ratifying it, and most importantly, has put in place a moratorium on execution of death penalties. In 2002, the Council of Europe made an additional step, adopting Protocol number 13 concerning the abolition of death penalty in all circumstances. In other words, also in time of war or in case of imminent threat of war. Reservations and derogations to this instrument are not possible. The protocol entered into force actually in 2003, immediately after its adoption, or very soon after its adoption. It has to date been ratified by 44 of the member states of the Council of Europe. The abolition of death penalty has been achieved, one should say and admit, with a top-down approach in most of the Council of Europe member states. The experience has been diverse. In some cases, the abolition was undertaken with enthusiasm from the public opinion. In other cases, with indifference. In some cases, there was also some inertia, or I would say resistance. In Ukraine, for instance, executions were carried out until 1997, 2 years after the country's accession to the Council of Europe. And it was actually the Constitutional Court of Ukraine itself which abolished in practice the death penalty by ruling that the death penalty was unconstitutional. The public opinion, and we have to admit it, was not always clearly in favor of the abolition, but this did never result in any major objections once the abolition was achieved. Even on the occasion of particularly gruesome crimes, very few ask for introduction of death penalty. However, dormant support for death penalty may still exist. And in some member states, it is important to dry out from the outset the grounds and the calls for reintroduction. And this is why the abolition of death penalty remains so high on the agenda of the Council of Europe and needs a multilateral support like the one that we have today. Commitment to abolition of death penalty needs actually multilateralism. And by the way, as all previous speakers have underlined, does not stop at Europe's borders. Heads of states of government of the Council of Europe called for universal abolition of death penalty at the Council of Europe summit held in 1997. And universal abolition can only be achieved by joining efforts with other international organizations, and this has been the Council of Europe strategy from the outset to contribute to outlawing this cruel punishment in the countries where it still exists. Of course, the United Nations, the OSCE, and the European Union are the major partners in this respect. And this is why the Council of Europe supports the United Nations General Assembly resolution calling for a worldwide moratorium on the use of death penalty. The Council of Europe and the European Union have also teamed up to encourage all countries to abolish death penalty and join the Global Alliance against the torture and death penalty. Let me also signal an important recent development, which echoes what Eamon Gilmore has said. The recent adoption by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe this year of a recommendation on measures against the trade of goods used for death penalty, torture, and other inhuman or degrading treatment. Mr. Chairman, I will not speak about the situation of Belarus, as we will discuss it thoroughly in session 2. But I would like to indicate that 2 of the Council of Europe observer states maintain capital punishment: the US, which enjoys observer status since 1995, and Japan, which is, by the way, celebrating the 25th anniversary as an observer state this year. The situation in these countries is being examined regularly by the Committee of Ministers, and the representatives of these 2 states are invited to present the state of play in their respective country. If requested, the Council of Europe would gladly share its experience in abolishing the death penalty with these 2 countries, as well as with any other state, including neighborhood countries such as Morocco and Tunisia, with whom the Council of Europe undertakes a special cooperation relationship. I said before that the death penalty has often been achieved through a top-down approach. However, it is important to understand what are the perceived obstacles that would prevent the abolition, because understanding them and removing them can help building the indispensable political will for the abolition of death penalty. As previous speakers have said, all studies show that the less people know about the topic of death penalty, the more they are in favor of keeping death penalty. Studies show that attitudes to sentencing become less punitive when people are provided with fuller information. And this is more evident when such information is combined with dialogue and public debate. Therefore, it is important to underline the vital role of civil society and media in providing reliable information and a forum for dialogue on the issue of capital punishment and its applications, so that the public becomes better informed, or perhaps should I say less disinformed. Apart from the political institutions of the Council of Europe, the Parliamentary Assembly, the Committee of Ministers, also the European Court of Human Rights plays a role in limiting the use of death penalty outside Europe. The landmark case in this respect, the Soering versus United Kingdom, in which the Strasbourg Court considered that the extradition by the United Kingdom to the United States of an applicant would constitute a violation of the prohibition of torture, and inhuman degrading treatment and punishment because of the phenomenon of death row is extremely important. Since then, the court has developed a rich and consistent case law directed at preventing persons being put at risk of the use of death penalty. And in that way, the unfortunate existence of death penalty in the legal regime of many member states of the United Nations is an impediment to criminal cooperation among states. It is not possible to extradite someone in a country where he or she would face death penalty. By the way, the European Convention on Extradition confirms this. It provides that extradition may be refused if the offense for which the extradition is requested is punishable with death penalty, unless the requesting party gives assurances that it will not be carried out. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude. The arguments against the death penalty are well known. It is cruel, it is irreversible, it is discriminatory, it has no restorative effect for the victims of crime, it is not dissuasive, it is ineffective, it is incompatible with fundamental rights. It is socially unnecessary and morally unacceptable. A state cannot claim to be delivering justice if it annihilates human life and human dignity by using violence. Also, the goals which are set in the 2030 agenda would undoubtedly be missed if the vision of justice and rule of law that is promoted therein is not aligned with the promotion and protection of human rights and dignity of all. The Council of Europe stands ready to share its experience and achieve abolition of death penalty worldwide, and to support the reforms of criminal justice systems that respect the rights of victims, the rights of the accused, and the interests of the society in respecting human rights, rule of law, and democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Iakomopoulos, and all the speakers for their involved presentations. The floor is now open for comments or questions, so please use the chat function. As I understand, some delegations have already asked for the floor. Due to time constraints, we limit ourselves to 5 interventions during each session. If time allows, we can go for more. So the first in my speaker list is the distinguished representative of Italy, Ambassador Stefano Baldi, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, George. I will try to be brief because, as you said, time is short. But let me say a few words because certainly Italy wishes to thank the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union for organizing this international conference, which is another important occasion to mark the EU commitment to the global campaign against death penalty. And as it was already remembered, Italy has a very long tradition in opposing death penalty and being at the forefront of the global campaign to abolish the death penalty since its beginning in the General Assembly back in the 1990s. And we firmly believe that death penalty is an inhuman and degrading punishment. As it has been already mentioned, it is not a deterrent to crime, while it makes judicial mistakes fatally irreversible. I think this is clear. It was very clear from all the speakers we heard up to now. On the other hand, campaigning against death penalty requires a constant and sincere effort to listen to those governments and societies who hold a different position, to respectfully engage with them in order to find alternative answers to their needs, to win their hearts and their minds. In this process, it is essential to promote awareness through the debates of the true effects of the death penalty on people sentenced often unjustly, on their families, on society. In this respect, we commend ODIHR for their annual background paper dealing with topics of great interest. And I'm glad that Matteo Mecacci mentioned this, of course. The last issue was dedicated to whether the death penalty constitutes an inherently arbitrary form of punishment. And we think we found it particularly relevant. We look forward, of course, to the 2021 volume. And it is indeed essential to promote debate at all levels with the society, among individuals and countries, between governments and parliaments, and also supporting the civil society organizations' priceless work. To improve collaboration with civil society on this issue, in 2014, we set up in our ministry an MFA civil society coordination task force, involving the Italian civil society organizations most active in the campaign against the death penalty. Most of them, I think you're very familiar with, the Community of Sant'Egidio, Hands Off Cain, and the Italian section of Amnesty International. But before posing my question, let me conclude just reminding that campaigning for the abolition of death penalty, it is not only about promoting policies, legislative changes, and judicial decisions. It is first and foremost about promoting the supreme value of the dignity of every single human being. And now, if I can, my question for the panelists, I don't know if there will be a time to answer, but certainly I would like really to ask if we consider the multilateral regional context, which is well represented today by the panel speakers, what could be the most effective way to have a constructive dialogue with retentionist countries? This is one major point. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Baldi. And next in my list of speakers of questions will be the permanent representative of Kazakhstan, followed by the permanent representative of Belarus. But please, dear Ambassador Kairat Umarov, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much for giving the floor. Dear colleagues, distinguished ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, my delegation welcomes today's discussion on the elimination of death penalty and thanks Portuguese presidency of the European Union for convening this virtual conference. I thank panelists for their detailed and insightful presentations. Kazakhstan considers abolishing the death penalty as one of the primary objectives of its human rights policy. In December last year, as part of the political reforms in my country, the president of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, initiated the procedure of joining the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Last September, it was signed in New York, and Kazakh parliament ratified it early this year. Moreover, my country has significantly increased its share of voluntary contributions to the International Commission against the death penalty. My president demonstrated the political will and convinced the parliament and the nation to move on from long-term moratorium on death penalty to officially joining the protocol. And taking example of my country, I have a question to the panelists. It is almost the same as it was asked by my previous colleague from Italy, Stefano, but still I'm very much interested in the way how we can effectively organize our work to urge other countries to show the political will to abolish the death penalty, and what needs to be done concretely for universalization of a ban. Because we know few countries that continue holding the moratorium, but not making another step forward. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Ambassador Umarov. Now I'll pass the screen to the distinguished permanent representative of Belarus, Ambassador Andrei Dobkunius. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, dear Ambassador. First, I would like to greet the hosts of this event and pay my respect to the important historic role that Portugal not only has played as a pioneer of the global effort to abolish capital punishment, but continues to play with its consistent advocacy of the principles of a more just and humane society. Уважаемый господин посол, Все знают, что по теме смертной казни в Европе Беларусь является единственным практическим объектом усилий уважаемых организаторов этой конференции. Поэтому, если позволите, я поделюсь некоторой информацией о положении дел по этому вопросу в моей стране. В Беларуси смертная казнь применяется крайне редко и только за особо тяжкие и жестокие преступления. Временное применение смертной казни до ее отмены предусмотрено Конституцией и было поддержано по итогам референдума в 1996 году. При этом в последние 1,5 года приговоры к смертной казни в стране в исполнение не приводились. На прошлой неделе были помилованы 2 белорусских граждан, ранее приговоренные к смертной казни. Наказание им заменено на пожизненное заключение. С участием профильных международных организаций в Беларуси идет формирование общественной поддержки и условий, которые могли бы способствовать неприменению смертной казни в судебной практике и в конечном итоге привели бы к мораторию или ее отмене. Примером продуктивного взаимодействия по этой теме может служить круглый стол по правовым аспектам возможной отмены смертной казни. Он был организован в 2018 году Советом Европы и рабочей группой парламента Беларуси по изучению смертной казни как инструмента наказания. В 2019 году тоже по линии Совета Европы в Минске состоялась конференция «Общественное мнение и смертная казнь в Беларуси». Прошли полезные дискуссии, в том числе о важности влияния на общественное мнение и роли информационных кампаний по теме смертной казни. Сейчас в Беларуси идет широкая общественная дискуссия в рамках планируемой конституционной реформы. Касается она и вопроса применения смертной казни. Вопрос о высшей мере наказания вызывает интерес у граждан. Об этом говорят обращения, поступающие как в парламент, так и членам Конституционной комиссии, которая разрабатывает проект новой Конституции. Все инициативы тщательно анализируются. После завершения экспертных дискуссий будет принято решение о формате дальнейшего законодательного рассмотрения этого вопроса. Уважаемый господин посол, в заключение я хочу отметить, что Беларусь готова к продолжению конструктивного взаимодействия с европейскими партнерами и международными организациями по тематике смертной казни, в том числе в формате совместных экспертных мероприятий с привлечением белорусских и зарубежных специалистов. Благодарю вас за внимание.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Puñas. Now I'll pass the screen to the permanent representative of Spain, Ambassador Luis Cuesta Civis. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, dear George. And let me also thank Portugal for the initiative of organizing this international conference on the death penalty as part of its program of as president of the Council of the European Union. I want to make this short intervention in order to reaffirm the Spanish commitment to the complete and universal abolition of the death penalty, which constitutes one of the priorities in the area of human rights as recently reflected in the External Action Strategy 2021-2024 of the government of Spain. The death penalty cannot be separated from human rights and represents an extremely cruel, inhuman, degrading, and irreparable penalty, which conflicts with the very conception and essence of human rights. Moratoria, de facto or de jure, should be a simple intermediate step towards complete abolition. We maintain that the role of the state is to protect life and human dignity without being able to allow it to retain the power to kill as a legalized punishment, and even less so in the cases of minors. In the same way, Spain urges that reforms of the legal systems be promoted in those cases in which capital penalties related to people with disabilities or LGBTIQ+ people are contemplated. The results of the recent vote on the 8th resolution on the moratorium on the use of the death penalty in the United Nations General Assembly on December 16 seem to confirm the general trend towards the abolition of the death penalty or the suspension of the death penalty executions as a preliminary step. Spain congratulates the states that have recently ratified the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and in particular welcomes the decision announced by Kazakhstan that can serve as an example for the creation of a large capital penalty-free zone in Central Asia. Within its commitment to reinforce multilateralism, Spain wishes to highlight the work of the International Commission Against the Death Penalty on its 10th anniversary and the efforts of quiet diplomacy and advice to the countries that have been lending their commissioners for the sake of progressive disappearance of capital punishment in the world. As a founding member, Spain welcomes the recent awarding of the North-South Prize to the International Commission Against the Death Penalty by the Council of Europe in recognition of its defense and protection of human rights. I thank you.
Thank you, dear Luis. So one final question or intervention, and I will give the floor to civil society organization, l'Ensemble pour la peine de mort, Monsieur Raphaël Chenouille-Azin. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, dear Chair. Thank you to the Portuguese presidency for this important event. Let me express to you my pleasure to be there and to discuss about the abolition of death penalty with all partners in abolition. I am the executive director of Ecpm, Ensemble contre la peine de mort, Together Against the Death Penalty. Most of you already know our organization, who is one of the international leading abolitionist organization. Ecpm has been working the last decade in favor of the abolition, universal abolition of the capital punishment. And every 3 years, Ecpm organizes the World Congress Against the Death Penalty, the largest and widely publicized abolitionist gathering around the world that bring together thousands of abolitionist actors from all 5 continents in order to work on the future strategies of the abolition. After Brussels 2019, who was held with the support of European Union, Belgium, Norway, and Switzerland, I have the pleasure to announce the organization of the next World Congress Against the Death Penalty in Berlin in November 2022. The exact date has to be confirmed. This time, during this edition, we will have a specific focus on the youth mobilization. The youth as a new public, new actors, new ambassadors, new targets. This Congress will be a kind of handover between generations. We will have as well a specific focus on unconventional allies. We will continue our business campaign launched during the last World Congress in Brussels Congress. We will launch a campaign on sports and death penalty. We will as well launch to find new goodwill ambassadors, because we need new allies in the fight against the death penalty. This Congress in Berlin 2022 will be the first time after the COVID crisis that we will be a real physical gathering all together, all the actors together to fight against the death penalty. But of course, we will plan digital solution to extend the participation of the World Congresses to a larger public. Berlin 2022 is organized under the sponsorship of Germany and in close collaboration with the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The role of European Union and all European organizations and specifically and also European state members is fundamental on the fight against the death penalty. The partnership between diplomacies and the civil society is the heart of our common success. Therefore, I take the occasion to invite all of you to join the next World Congress in Berlin 2022 and to contact me or to contact Ecpm. Let's build the future of the abolition all together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your intervention. And now I will give back the screen to our panelists in reverse order for short comments and answers. So first, Mr. Iakomopoulos, please, the screen is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that the just to reply briefly, the best way to move and convince states that have not yet abolished the death penalty is to try to remove the impediments that exist or that are perceived as existing for abolition, and above all, to convince the political leadership in these countries that the public opinion is not against the abolition of death penalty. This requires raising awareness of the public, so specific and thorough and robust action from the civil society and the media, which also strategically means that promotion of free media and free civil society is important. Also open debate in parliament, and of course legal arguments which can be brought towards the judiciary, in particular the constitutional courts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now Mr. Matteo Mecacci, please.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador. I agree with what has just been said, so I will not repeat. I would like just to mention that our 2021 background paper will focus on a deeper analysis of the countries and situations where the abolition has happened, try to shed light on which elements played a critical role in achieving this goal. And sometimes these things can happen for different reasons. Sometimes there is a political decision from the top. Sometimes there's society that mobilizes and shares information and push the political class to move into that direction. So I think one of the commitments of the OSCE participating states is to continue to share information and shed light on the various aspects of the abolishment of how the executions are carried out. And so I think this will be a critical element to try to engage on a fact-based analysis of why the capital execution still exists and what society really thinks about that, including the victims or the families of those who are affected by crimes or murders. And then sometimes there is a perception that these people will be always in favor of this kind of retribution. This is not the case, and there is increasing evidence and research that support this.
Thank you once again. And now Mr. Gilmore, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, can I welcome the announcement of the World Congress in Berlin in 2022. The very first event that I attended in my current capacity as Special Representative for Human Rights was the World Congress Against the Death Penalty in Brussels in February of 2019, and you can count on the EU support for this. To address the question of what can we effectively do, I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's about political will, and I think that's a combination of two things. One is it's about political leadership, and secondly, it's about winning hearts and minds. And when I talk with countries which are still retaining the death penalty, I very often find that one of the most effective arguments that I can make is when I tell them that I was a member of the Irish Parliament in 1990, not that awfully long ago, 1990, when we decided finally to abolish the death penalty. And I remember the public debate, and I remember the debate in the Parliament. And I think one of the ways in which I think we can do it is perhaps by getting countries, getting states in the United States, for example, that have recently been through these debates and through these arguments to perhaps share their experiences and how they addressed issues like deterrence, issues about issues of victims and so on, with countries that are still to abolish the death penalty, and perhaps to help and encourage those countries to move to the political leadership that's required to bring about abolition. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the three speakers and the audience for this interesting and insightful debate. We'll move to section 2 in a few seconds. Please stay tuned. So,
Thank you very much, and let me start this second session by introducing myself. I'm the Ambassador of Norway to the OSCE. Let me also extend my gratitude and greetings to Portugal for organizing this event, and also for the initiative and leadership role that you play on this issue in the OSCE and internationally. We are now moving into the legal and institutional aspects of death penalty. There are, of course, very many angles to this topic, and to understand its consequences, it is obviously important to understand the system itself. We have two guests who will help us explore this topic. We have with us Andrei Paluda. He's a human rights activist, a former police officer, representing the organization of Jasna in Belarus, and also the human rights defenders against the death penalty. Very happy to have you with us from Belarus. We also have a representative from the US, which is Madame Denise Leboeuf, attorney, capital defender on the state and federal level. She's also been a director to the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, on capital punishment and John Adams projects. So good morning to you in the US. There are, of course, not many similarities between Belarus and the US, except being the two OSCE participating states practicing death penalty. But on the other side, we do see that there are interesting developments in both countries on the issue, also when it comes to the legal issues. So we are looking forward to hearing your thought. Let me therefore start by giving the floor, or rather the screen, to you, Mr. Andrei Paluda, on the situation in Belarus regarding the death penalty. Mr. Paluda, please, the screen is yours.
Добрый день, уважаемые участники конференции. Я с большой благодарностью отношусь к возможности использовать данную трибуну, так как в последнее время в связи с различными проблемами, с которыми сталкивается общество в разных странах, связанных с эпидемиологической ситуацией, экономической, общественно-политической и другими, отодвигаются на задний план не менее важные для общества проблемы. Такие проблемы, как насилие в семье, проблемы ЛГБТК+, сообщества, людей с инвалидностью, людей, живущих с ВИЧ и многие-многие другие. И, несомненно, конечно же, проблема смертной казни, которая, на мой взгляд, должна оставаться в повестке прав человека на постоянной основе. Мне сказали, что у меня 15 минут, и, конечно же, это не так много времени, чтобы в своем выступлении очень глубоко и детально рассмотреть проблему смертной казни в Беларуси. Тем не менее, я бы хотел затронуть основные моменты данной темы, а в последующем, в той части, где у нас будет возможность вопросов-ответов, продолжить разговор об этой проблеме в форме дискуссии. Итак, достаточно часто, выступая на подобного рода встречах, многие участники, говоря о Беларуси, начинают свою речь с того, что Беларусь – последняя страна в Европе и на постсоветском пространстве, где сохранился такой вид наказания, как смертная казнь. В принципе, я также мог бы начать свое выступление именно с этой фразы, потому что принципиально ничего не изменилось. В Беларуси по-прежнему судами выносится такой вид наказания, как смертная казнь. Хотя стоит отметить, что в регионе ОБСЕ Беларусь не одинока в этом смысле. По большому счету, смертная казнь в Беларуси – это один из элементов такого советского наследия, наряду с другими такими, не знаю, как пример, может быть, памятники Ленину в каждом городе, советские названия улиц и многое другое. Даже сама процедура приведения в исполнение смертного приговора, она плавно перекочевала из советских инструкций и положений в законодательстве. Смертная казнь в Республике Беларусь может быть назначена мужчинам, совершившим преступление после наступления 18-летнего возраста и не достигшим к моменту вынесения приговора 65 лет. Приводится в исполнение путем расстрела, ну и, в принципе, как видно из того, что я сказал, в отношении несовершеннолетних и женщин такой вид наказания в нашей стране не применяется. Вообще, Уголовный кодекс Республики Беларусь предусматривает возможность применения смертной казни по 13 видам преступлений, из них 11 в мирное время и еще 2 военные. Виды преступления разные, но, как правило, они сопряжены с умышленным лишением жизни человека при отягчающих обстоятельствах. Я могу назвать даже несколько для примера. Это международный терроризм, геноцид, развязывание либо ведение агрессивной войны, террористический акт, измена государства, сопряженная с убийством, убийство при отягчающих обстоятельствах. Правда, стоит отметить еще такой момент, что ни одна из статей не требует обязательного смертного приговора и имеет альтернативу в виде пожизненного заключения либо длительных сроков. Правоприменительная практика в нашей стране такова, что к смертной казни, как правило, приговаривают за убийство 2 и более лиц, либо за убийство с особой жестокостью. Как правило, приговоренные – это не серийные убийцы, и, скажем так, непрофессиональные киллеры. Чаще всего причинами становятся бытовые конфликты в состоянии алкогольного опьянения. Как правило, большинство приговоренных к смертной казни ранее уже привлекались к уголовной ответственности. Отдельно стоит отметить еще и, наверное, тот случай, который произошел в 2011 году, когда смертный приговор был вынесен двум лицам, 2 приговоренным по статье терроризм. Это по факту взрыва в Минском метро, достаточно известный кейс. Приговоренный к смертной казни в нашей стране содержится в СИЗО номер 1 города Минска на улице Владарского, так называемом Пищаловском замке. Время, в течение которого осужденный ждет расстрел, в законе не оговорено, но составляет, как правило, от 3 месяцев до года и нескольких месяцев. Точная дата исполнения приговора хранится в секрете, в том числе и для самого приговоренного, для его родственников, адвоката, общественности. Она, по сути, известна только руководителю расстрельной команды. Насколько мы знаем, в день казни осужденного проводят через подземный переход из камеры, в которой он содержался, в специальную камеру для казни, зачитывают акт отказа в помиловании, уточняют анкетные данные, завязывают глаза, ставят на колени. Смертная казнь осуществляется путем расстрела, путем выстрела в затылок из специального пистолета. Помимо членов расстрельной команды в камере присутствует прокурор, который следит за законностью процедуры, врач, который в последующем констатирует смерть. Место захоронения тел не разглашается, что становится дополнительным стрессом для родственников расстрелянных, которые не могут ни похоронить их тела по традициям семьи, а в последующем не имеют места, где бы они могли оплакивать своего сына, отца, мужа, своего родственника. Мне достаточно часто задают вопрос, для чего это делается, в чем причина такой завесы секретности. На мой взгляд, это как раз и связано с советским таким наследием. Как были инструкции и процедуры в советское время, так они перекочевали в настоящую реальность. В советское время это делалось в том числе для того, чтобы скрыть истинные масштабы репрессий, которые происходили в то время в той стране. И это, на мой взгляд, была одна из главных причин. Да, и, кстати, журналисты часто меня спрашивают, а вы и другие правозащитники выступаете за мораторий как первый шаг, либо вообще сразу за отмену смертной казни? Почему бы не пойти путем шаг за шагом и, например, не пытаться улучшить условия содержания для данных лиц, чтобы попробовать добиться, чтобы тела выдавались, или способ казни был более гуманным? Ну, вы знаете, потому что, наверное, мораторий, он, во-первых, решает сразу все эти обозначенные проблемы, а во-вторых, мне даже сложно представить, как можно сделать гуманным такой негуманный вид наказания, как лишение свободы, лишение жизни. Если поговорить немножко о статистике, то в первые годы независимости каждый год в Республике Беларусь выносились десятки смертных приговоров, доходило и до 47, это было несколько лет, даже с таким показателем количественным. Начиная с 2000 года их количество резко пошло на спад, и в первую очередь это было связано в том числе с внесением изменений в Уголовный кодекс и введением такого вида наказания, как пожизненное заключение и более длительные сроки. Точное количество осужденных к смертной казни не разглашается. В основном правозащитники узнают об исполнении приговоров от родственников осужденных. Все это, конечно же, опять из-за завесы секретности. Нам известно более 300 вынесенных приговоров за период независимости, А вот о количестве расстрелянных точно неизвестно, и в том числе из-за отсутствия этих данных, а еще и в том числе еще об одном таком советском наследии. Насколько мы знаем, приговоренных к смертной казни в советское время в СССР в последующем приводили в исполнение приговоры уже в независимой Беларуси, и, соответственно, это тоже может влиять на статистику. В настоящее время мы знаем о том, что в коридоре смерти находится 2 человека с вступившими в законную силу приговорами, это Павлов и Сергей. И это значит, что приговор в их отношении может быть приведен в исполнение абсолютно в любой момент. Один человек, это Виктор Скрундзик, в настоящий момент проходит, или можно сказать, проходил процедуру апелляционного обжалования. Я вот только вернулся с заседания Верховного суда. Это достаточно уникальный кейс для Беларуси, так как в прошлом году Верховный суд на таком же апелляционном заседании, в апелляционном порядке отменял смертную казнь в отношении Скрундзика. И, кстати, за период деятельности нашей кампании против смертной казни в Беларуси с 2009 года это был всего лишь 2-й такой случай. Однако в этом году в январе коллегия по уголовным делам Минского областного суда вновь вынесла смертный приговор в отношении Скрундзика. И вот как раз сегодня проходило рассмотрение его жалобы в апелляционном порядке, и приговор оставили в силе. То есть, по сути, мы можем говорить о том, что у нас таких человека 3. Да, кстати, действительно, на прошлой неделе мы узнали такую информацию, сейчас ее официально уже подтвердили официальные представители государства на этой конференции, о том, что в отношении братьев Костевых, которые были приговорены к смертной казни в прошлом году, осуществлен акт помилования. Процедурно это значит, что им заменили расстрел на пожизненное заключение. Конечно, с одной стороны, это вселяет осторожную надежду, как и тот факт, который был уже озвучен, о том, что последний из известных приведенных в исполнение смертных приговоров был 17 декабря 2019 года в отношении Александра Осиповича. Прошло уже 1,5 года. Многие даже говорят о том, что это мораторий на исполнение приговоров де-факто. Скажу так, очень хотелось бы в это верить, но пока нет системных изменений, пока у нас есть такой вид наказания, как смертная казнь, новые приговоры, вот как сегодня апелляция подтвердила, и, кстати, новые расстрелы, новое приведение в исполнение приговоров могут произойти в любой момент. Кстати, вот мы упоминали последний приведенный в исполнение приговор в декабре 2019 года, до этого, чуть раньше, в июне 2019 года. Кстати, в преддверии Европейских игр правозащитники узнали о приведении в исполнение приговора в отношении Александра Жильникова и Вячеслава Сухарка. И, кстати, стоит отметить, что и у Осиповича, расстрелянного в декабре 2019 года, и у Жильникова были зарегистрированы обращения в Комитет ООН по правам человека, и Комитет по правам человека обращался к Республике Беларусь с просьбой не приводить в исполнение приговора. Тем не менее, как почти по 2 десяткам других подобных случаев, данная просьба была проигнорирована, и люди расстреляны. Если немножко кратко, тезисно остановиться о перспективах, да, действительно, в начале текущего года достаточно активно обсуждалась у нас в стране информация о том, что по инициативе правоохранительных органов планируют отменить смертную казнь. Отменить как вид наказания, то есть убрать ее из Уголовного кодекса, просто не будет такого вида наказания. Скажу прямо, я достаточно скептически к этому относился, и, как показало дальнейшее развитие ситуации, не зря. По факту этого не произошло. В последней редакции закона об изменении кодексов по вопросам уголовной ответственности смертная казнь, как и прежде, перечисляется как один из видов наказания. По сути, такое предложение об внесении изменений в Уголовный кодекс на данный момент не обсуждается. Возможно, власти планируют вынести данный вопрос на референдум по внесению изменений в Конституции. Речь идет о том, что планируется проведение данного референдума в январе следующего года. Но опять же, сразу хотел бы отметить, что и моя позиция, и позиция моих коллег-правозащитников однозначна. Подобные чувствительные вопросы, как смертная казнь, которые во многом находятся в очень серьезной эмоциональной плоскости, решать посредством референдума недопустимо. Мы считаем, что решение данной проблемы должно приниматься посредством политической воли, как это было в других странах. Тем более с точки зрения законодательства никаких преград этому нет, о чем Конституционный суд Беларуси высказывался уже в достаточно далеком 2004 году. Будем надеяться, что тенденции, которые наметились сейчас, они сохранятся. И Беларусь будет среди других европейских стран, где нет такого вида наказания, как смертная казнь. Прошло почти 15 минут. Спасибо за внимание. И я надеюсь на ваши вопросы и активную дискуссию. Большое спасибо.
Большое спасибо, Andrei. Thank you very much, Mr. Paluda. Very interesting to hear your assessment on how this is being practiced and discussed in Belarus. Let me now cross the Atlantic and listen to what Dna Leblanc has to say on the legal aspects of death penalty in the US. Dna, good morning, and the screen is yours.
Good afternoon to you. Thank you. Good morning here. Let me first say that it's an honor to speak to such a distinguished assembly. I'm very grateful to the Portuguese presidency of the European Union, and especially to Ambassador Carlos Brito, who apparently has endless energy for this issue and has brought this conference together. Much gratitude. I'm just a lawyer, one of a number of lawyers in the United States who have spent their career fighting the death penalty here. I have won and lost in every way it's possible to win and lose a capital case. I've been part of a team that drove up to death row and got a guy off death row and into my car and back to New Orleans to freedom. He was completely exonerated of the crime he committed after many years on death row. And I've also been in the execution chamber at midnight when my client was killed. I'm humbled to be with our European teachers on this issue, our leaders and teachers, and to learn from you. And I'll close my brief remarks with some small suggestions or requests of ways that you can continue to help us. The legal enterprise of capital punishment requires lawmakers, judges, and eventually juries to implement a system of distinguishing the worst of the worst in a system that in the US must be able to withstand constitutional scrutiny. To believe in a death penalty that is applied to the worst of the worst, you must believe in two propositions. You must believe that there are some convicted murderers who, by virtue of who they are and what they've done, have lost the right to life. And you must believe that the law, statutes, and jurisprudence can reliably distinguish between murderers of that sort and other convicted murderers who are not the worst. That second proposition, I think, fails empirically on the evidence in the United States. And the first, I think, fails the test of international human rights proposition that the right to life is non-derogable. A very short history. In the United States in 1972, the Supreme Court, the justices writing 9 separate opinions, found that the practice of capital punishment at the time was unconstitutional, largely because it was random and arbitrary. There was no way to distinguish between one convicted murderer who was sentenced to death and another equally culpable who was not. The impermissible factor of race was considered to be the deciding factor. The very fact that there was no method, no system for deciding was considered evidence of a failed system. 4 years later, a number of states brought new laws to the court, and the court held that some of them were constitutional. A mandatory death sentence was rejected, but the death penalty was reinstated in the United States. From that day to this, the courts of the United States have struggled to patch up the system, to fine-tune laws and jurisprudence. Justice Harry Blackmun, who was one of the justices who reinstated the death penalty, who was on the court in 1994, said famously, "I no longer shall tinker with the machinery of death." We're 27 years on from that realization, and we're still tinkering. The United States represents to the international community, explicitly in writing, that the capital punishment system of the United States is reserved for the worst of the worst. It is applied only after thorough trials at which the defendant is given every legal, investigative, and expert assistance required for constitutional fairness. The reality is very different. Trials are infected with racism. 1 out of every 10 persons condemned to death is later found to be completely innocent of the crime for which they were convicted. The United States executed persons for crimes committed as children as recently as 2005. The law exempted intellectually disabled persons only in 2003, and to this day does not exempt the severely mentally ill from execution. The legal system allows inhumane prison conditions and years of mental torture and solitary confinement. In fact, rather than US constitutional law elevating the application of capital punishment, the truth is that the death penalty corrodes the legal protections and the legal values throughout our criminal justice system. The death penalty is a practice which cannot be reformed and must be abolished. Let me mention 2 aspects of the US system of capital punishment where the practice diverges from the ideal and which are in part responsible for the harms I've mentioned. One is death qualification of the jury. US capital trials are bifurcated. They come in 2 parts. In the first part, it looks much like any homicide trial. The jury is requested to look at the evidence presented by the prosecution, look at any defense that is made, and decide whether the prosecution has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the client is guilty. Then if the person is found guilty of a capital offense, there is a second trial on penalty. There's opening statements again, there's arguments, there's evidence of mitigation and evidence of aggravation. What made the crime worse, what makes it more understandable, mitigates it. And there's an argument for life in prison, usually is the alternative sentence, or the death penalty. The jury goes back and deliberates again. In order to choose one jury to do those 2 trials, the jury has to be death qualified. And they are permitted under our law to be asked, do you believe in the death penalty? Can you consider the death penalty as a verdict? Which eliminates 45% of the American people who don't believe in the death penalty. The latest polls generally show about a belief in the death penalty, or an answer to a straight question, do you believe in the death penalty? About 55% say yes, which is 45% no. If you ask, do you think life in prison is the preferred sentence for a capital case, for a capital homicide, 60% prefer it, which means that there's that delta are people who theoretically believe in death, but prefer a life sentence. death qualification of the jury eliminates the people who cannot consider a death sentence because they don't believe in it. It also means that you start a trial, which will eventually determine whether or not the person is actually guilty, by talking about whether or not you believe in the death penalty, which is a signal to jurors who are not lawyers that the person must be guilty. It also means that the jury is more prone to conviction. It is more likely to be Republican of our two parties. It is more likely to believe that the police do a good job and that they're trustworthy. And it is more likely to dismiss social science about implicit race bias. The second aspect of the US system that I want to touch on is the extraordinarily wide latitude given to prosecutors. Despite the requirement that a murder must be aggravated in some way in order to qualify for the death penalty, most homicides in most capital states and in the federal system can qualify as a capital case. And in the states, California, which has 700 people on death row, almost any homicide could theoretically qualify as a capital homicide. It's up to the prosecutor, the individual chief prosecutor in the county or jurisdiction where the homicide was committed, to decide whether or not to pursue the death penalty. And study after study has shown that those prosecutors tend to be white, they tend to be male, and they tend to be affected by race bias and the other biases that have been mentioned. I want to mention a bit about where to go from here. Currently, the death penalty is at its lowest. So when I say reform is not the answer, I'm certainly not opposed to reforms. Reforms of lawyering, reforms of the courts, lots of activism and advocacy have helped. We've never had fewer executions, fewer death sentences. Virginia, one of the states of the old Confederacy, was the first such state to abolish. It's a wonderful moment. The many proposals that were mentioned earlier should be continued, of course, from the European Union and from our European allies and teachers, including the prohibition of importing or exporting the tools of lethal injection, for example. But I'd like to take a look at what the federal government can do, and specifically what the new administration can do. There has been a sea change in the comments of the United States. If you look at our UPR submissions in 2020 under President Trump, there was a robust defense of the death penalty with some of the worst, nearly salacious description of crimes. And it was a defense of the spree of executions conducted at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. President Biden has submitted, his State Department has submitted a statement for the UPR just last month, in which it says, President Biden supports legislatively ending the death penalty at the federal level and incentivizing states to follow the federal government's example, which is a wonderful improvement. And I urge in conversations and communications with the United States that you repeat that, you encourage the steps that the United States can take to carry that out. I think there are, however, a number of measures that can be taken to restrict the death penalty, the federal death penalty, without legislation. So the executive branch can, on its own, cease all capital prosecutions as we start to recover our criminal justice system from COVID. the Department of Justice can withdraw all appellate briefs. They can commute all death sentences. They can dismantle the capital prosecution unit. And I hope that our European allies and teachers hold us to that. Thank you very much for the chance to speak to you.
Thank you so much, Dani, for sharing your experience and perspectives, also on quite specific issues. This was indeed very educative and thought-provoking. Thank you, both of you, for your efforts to be with us today, both in Belarus and the US, despite time difference, and of course, the severeness of the issue. We will now allow for a short round of questions and answers. Due to time limitations, we will allow for a few questions and then go back to our speakers for your comments in the end of this session. So I would encourage you all to keep your comments short and come to your question rather quickly. The first speaker on my list is from the Council of Europe, Madam Tatiana Temacic. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair. I actually do not have a question, but I wanted a little bit to tell you about the Council of Europe's experience in working with Belarus on the abolition of the death penalty. So we had a very detailed account from Andrei Paluda just now, and it was, we also heard a very interesting update from Ambassador Dabkiunas. And if you allow me, I will complement what we heard. So there are many reasons why Belarus is not part of the Council of Europe. And one of them is that the death penalty has not been abolished. Belarus's special guest status in the Parliamentary Assembly, a preliminary step for joining the organization, was frozen as a result of the 1996 referendum, which included a question on whether or not the death penalty should be abolished. And at that time, indeed, as we heard, more than 80% of the voters voted for its retention. But at that time, it's important to know that the only alternative to the death penalty for particularly serious crimes was 15 years of imprisonment. And since then, the possibility of imposing life imprisonment has been indeed introduced in the criminal code. So since that time, the Council of Europe has been having a dialogue with the authorities and has supported civil society initiatives over 2 decades. All the arguments in favor of abolition, I think, have been elaborated in many fora, be it in Minsk, in the regions of Belarus, or in Strasbourg and Brussels. And it's true that the single response we've heard from the authorities is we cannot go against the will of the public opinion. And although political will and leadership are sufficient to abolish the death penalty, it is important to hear the arguments against abolition and to build abolition strategies around them. And thus, the Council of Europe has developed a strategy with Belarus. It was 1, understanding the obstacles, 2, a dialogue with all the stakeholders, including the legislative branch, executive, the judiciary, the prosecution, and of course the civil society, which plays a very important role. Then 3, sharing of knowledge, and 4, the development of joint approaches to achieve abolition. So over the years, there has been, I would say, 3 concrete areas of progress. The first one is the decision of the Constitutional Court we heard about of 2004, which declared that the death penalty should be a temporary measure and that ultimately it should be abolished. Second, a parliamentary working group was established over a decade ago, And in 2019, following the Council of Europe's advice, the authorities changed its name, and that I think is important. It changed the name from Working Group on the Study of the Question of the Death Penalty to Working Group on the Study on the Question of the Abolition of the Death Penalty. But the outburst of the COVID pandemic has prevented the Council of Europe from providing support to the new composition of the working group, notably as regards the development of specific terms of reference with the expected results to be clearly defined. And the last area of progress, which is worthwhile mentioning, is that prior to the 9th of August elections, the civil society has become an interlocutor of the authorities in the dialogue on abolition. So now no one can predict what will happen in the coming weeks or months, but it is not excluded that the death penalty could be abolished as part of a constitutional reform. And this would be a most welcome development. And of course, we are ready to continue working with Belarus towards abolition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting information also on the significant role that the Council of Europe plays on this issue in Europe and in Belarus in particular. Thank you so much. The next speaker on my list is the Russian Federation with Nikolai Kalashnikov, Senior Counselor of the OSCE delegation here in Vienna. Please, Nikolai, the screen is yours.
Спасибо, госпожа посол, за предоставление мне права выступить. Спасибо организаторам за приглашение Российской Федерации также принять участие в этом мероприятии. Так сказать, буду краток, чтобы не занимать слишком много времени своими ремарками. Перед тем, как я задам конкретный вопрос нашим уважаемым спикерам, которые только что нам рассказали о ситуации в двух странах, несколько ремарочек, которые, так сказать, по существу вопроса. Поскольку для того, чтобы обсуждать вопрос, мы должны быть максимально конкретны, и чтобы показать глубину проблемы, мы должны говорить о конкретных случаях, что здесь происходит. И учитывая, что мы в данном случае находимся не только на пространстве Евросоюза, Совета Европы, но и ОБСЕ, хотел бы именно этот фактор отметить и исходить из него при дальнейших наших комментариях. Как известно, на пространстве ОБСЕ самым ярким примером применения смертной казни, его широты и, так сказать, масштабов является одно государство. Это Соединенные Штаты Америки. Именно на примере этого государства я хотел бы несколько ремарочек. Кстати, насколько мне известно, Соединенные Штаты не входили никогда в состав Советского Союза, поэтому чьим наследием является смертная казнь в этом государстве, остается для нас вопросом, оставим его историкам. Мы ни в коем случае не оспариваем право государств, закрепленных в том числе и в международном праве, на самостоятельность в этом вопросе. Однако главная проблема, как мы знаем, не только в самом факте применения этого наказания, а в масштабах этого феномена, его соразмерности преступному деянию, формам и методам применения на практике и соответствия нормам международного права в области прав человека, включая обязательства ОБСЕ. В этом плане, как я сказал, вернемся к конкретной ситуации, в конкретной стране, в которой по всем этим параметрам однозначно среди лидеров, не только на пространстве ОБСЕ, но и немного шире. Смертная казнь в Соединенных Штатах применяется издавна, применяется широко и системно. В этом плане мы должны выделить масштабы проблемы. Накопленные в США практика вынесения смертных приговоров привела к тому, что само приведение их исполнения на протяжении последних десятилетий, не лет, а десятилетий, с правовой и институциональной точки зрения стало носить, как бы дико это ни звучало, плановый характер. Вспомним Советский Союз, опять же, где была плановая экономика, но там планировали строительство школ, детских садов, дорог, улиц. Здесь же немножко другое планирование. Да? В этом можно легко убедиться, если вы почитаете доклады профильных американских НПО, которые на основании данных официальных структур отражают планы конкретных штатов. Госпожа Лебев здесь уже упоминала например, штат Калифорния, да, там 700, так сказать, настоящих, ожидающих в очереди, так сказать, своей участи. А в институциональном плане, опять же, проблема в последние годы усугубилась за счет того, что пару лет назад в США восстановили эту высшую меру наказания на федеральном уровне. Сейчас, правда, в этой стране стало модно списывать все проблемы, в том числе и эту, на администрацию предшественника, господина Байдена, Дональда Трампа. Дескать, мы-то хорошие, да вот Трамп натворил дел. Ну, в истории мы уже знаем, как, например, там, на наших известных бывших советских республиках, там, Прибалтике, например, в которых там последние 30 лет все беды и невзгоды объясняются, так сказать, бывшим советским прошлым. Ну, действительно, тот же самый случай. К огорчению таких вот заявителей хотел бы напомнить, что правомерность введения смертной казни на федеральном уровне была подтверждена высшей судебной инстанцией США. Выделю, что инстанцией, которая принадлежит к судебной ветви власти и которая, как утверждают некоторые эксперты США, независима от исполнительной и законодательной ветви власти. Хотел бы остановиться еще на паре моментов, прежде чем перейти к вопросу. В частности, к методам применения смертной казни в США. Здесь в формате ОБСЕ, на форматах постсоветских и других форматах мы уже много об этом говорили, поэтому буквально кратко. В США в большинстве случаев методы смертной казни, я опять же, госпожа Любовь частично на этом останавливалась, это введение смертельной инъекции и применение так называемого электрического стула. Оба метода, по мнению экспертов, не отличаются гуманностью и граничат с применением пыток. К физическим пыткам следует добавить и психологические, которые испытывают смертники, дожидающиеся иногда десятилетиями часа X. Ну, чтобы подсветить масштабы проблемы, высокая доля судебных ошибок при вынесении американскими судами смертных приговоров. Только известных подтвержденных случаев в США порядка 180, когда казнь состоялась, а потом выяснилось, что человек невиновен. И еще один фактор – системный расизм, о нем тоже здесь говорилось, являющийся фактором при вынесении приговоров, в том числе смертных, который приводит к тому, что доля афроамериканцев, и не только их, в этой смертельной статистике существенно превышает долю белого населения. Тут, кстати, была небольшая дискуссия по поводу, отвечая на вопрос в первой сессии, как, так сказать, можно каким-то образом убедить государство перейти к отмене смертной казни. И отвечая на этот вопрос, представитель Совета Европы соответствующим образом ответил. Я согласен с ним, что лучшее средство убедить к отказу от смертной казни – это установление диалога на эту тему, проведение каких-то дискуссий и так далее, а не, как в ряде случаев бывает, введение каких-то санкций против государств, якобы не выполняющих или не следующих международным правилам или соглашениям в области прав человека. Ну и в качестве вопроса хотел бы задать его госпоже Любовь. Спасибо вам отдельно за ваше выступление и конкретные детали, и картину, которую вы описали, ситуацию в стране с легалистской точки зрения. Так вот, с учетом вышесказанного, хотел бы задать вопрос, что конкретно делается в вашей стране, чтобы искоренить, если не саму смертную казнь, на этот вопрос вы уже вроде бы как дали ответ, то хотя бы те жестокие методы ее осуществления, о которых я только что говорил. Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much, Nikolai, for your comments and questions. I have only one more speaker on my list, which is Mr. Oleg Leshanyuk from the Belarusian Institute on the State University. So please, Mr. Leshanyuk, it is your turn.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'll try to be brief. My name is Oleg Leshanyuk. I'm the head of the Center for International Studies, Belarusian State University. The death penalty and the issues related to its application for many years have been a stumbling block on the Belarusian way to the Council of Europe. We remain the last country in Europe where this type of punishment continues to be applied, though in a very rare cases. However, recently Belarus have been conducting an open dialogue with the Council of Europe and foreign experts on this topic. A parliamentary working group researched the question of the abolition of the death penalty. Due to various reasons, including epidemiological ones, the dynamics of the discussions has been decreased. However, in this context on the ongoing constitutional reform in Belarus, this issue again became a part and parcel of public and expert discussions. The death penalty issues are closely studied at various platforms. The current international political situation in Belarus is a zone of verification. The tragedy of the further movement in the long-term perspective depends on the decision taken in the coming months. It's open opportunities for expert and civil society to interact on such fundamental and sharp discussion as the possible abolition of death penalty. As you know, public opinion on this issue is rather contradictory, and not only in Belarus, but also in other countries that have already abolished the death penalty. Undoubtedly, the abolition of this type of punishment can create a positive background for cooperation in many other areas. But if we analyze the current foreign policy context, the Belarusian authorities are not given any special incentives to move forward. The ongoing constitutional reform in the country is in fact deliberately ignored by European politicians. The sanctions spiral continues to unwind. Project cooperation with the public sector is frozen. All existing human rights mechanisms have been applied against Belarus. Investigation platforms are multiplying like mushrooms. We hear the same accusations and ultimatums calls for isolation and increased pressure on Belarus. At the same time, the official position of Minsk is not heeded, which speaks on the ongoing unpredictable crisis of confidence. Therefore, perhaps this right now, it is necessary to take the courage for an unbiased assessment, even despite the general confrontation mainstream, and return to the objective analysis of the situation on cooperation in fundamental issues to which the death penalty issue is certainly refers. It is obvious that this should be a bilateral reciprocal movement towards each other. In this case, perhaps the Belarusian side will have additional motivation to actively change the current situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lezhanyuk, for your intervention as well. I see that the list of speakers is then extended, so I would then like to go back to our participants for a final round. To what extent you may answer the questions maybe, and also if you have some final comments for us to end this session. So please, we will start with Dna Leblanc. I will give the screen to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Carlson, and thank you for your help today. The direct question was about litigation or efforts to stop the cruel methods of execution. There have been almost continuously in the struggle to oppose the death penalty, there have been cases brought to say that the current method is unconstitutionally cruel. So there's a separate doctrine that says you can't litigate. It's, you know, distinct from the proposition that the death penalty is always a violation of human rights, which is, of course, what I believe and most abolitionists believe. But to say that although it's legal and permissible in the United States, nevertheless, it's not legal and permissible to torture someone to death. So there have been successive waves of efforts by proponents of the penalty to say this is a humane way to kill someone. And there have been, it's been demonstrated that the gas chamber, for example, caused undue suffering. Certainly it has been demonstrated that electrocution, which was used in many states for many years, caused gruesome errors, and people were grievously tortured before they were killed. And now there's been a good bit of litigation on the forms of lethal injection and the drugs that are used, and evidence that is fairly incontrovertible that certain persons and certain combinations of drugs, while perhaps masking the suffering, still induce unacceptable levels of suffering. My own perception is that the courts have to be willing to accept physical suffering if they accept a death penalty, and they seem willing to do so at this point. The other observation is that, of course, nothing can be done to lessen the tremendous psychological suffering of someone condemned to death who waits for years for the penalty to be carried out. I want to make one other quick comment on the ambassador's comment that it's fashionable to dump on President Trump, former President Trump. The 13 executions, 12 men and 1 woman who were executed in the last 8 months of the Trump administration were a resurgence of the death penalty, but those individuals, those persons, had all been put on death row under other presidents. And President Obama was not, his position on the death penalty has moved. He is more of an abolitionist now than he was, but he had the opportunity to commute some of those sentences and did not take it. So we are urging President Biden, who is an abolitionist, who does believe in ending the death penalty, to commute all the death sentences so that a future president could not, in fact, resume executions.
Thank you so much for your comments. I will then pass the floor to Mr. Paluda in Belarus. Please, you have the final screen, please.
Спасибо большое. Одну секунду. Спасибо большое за возможность, предоставленную. К сожалению, не прозвучало вопросы конкретно ко мне, но я просто небольшой тезис все-таки хотел бы сказать о том, что действительно, на мой взгляд, если Беларусь отменит смертную казнь, то это открывает дополнительные очень большие возможности как и государству, так и обществу в целом. Это не только участие в каких-то международных структурах. Мы знаем, что одним из аргументов против смертной казни является то, что наличие смертной казни раскручивает спираль жестокости в обществе. Мне кажется, нам нужно идти в другую сторону от этого. И как сейчас модно говорить в Беларуси, мне кажется, пора уже перевернуть эту страницу, сделать достоянием истории такой вид наказания, пусть и не самой лучшей истории в нашей стране такой вид наказания, и поставить в этом вопросе такую серьезную точку. Спасибо.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your participation here today. And I do hope that you will seize the opportunity to also participate on the rest of the seminar. This session has come to an end. I will also thank the participants who posed questions. And I'm also grateful that I was allowed to participate as your moderator in this session. I think we will take just a couple of seconds break, and then we will move on with session 3. So please give us a second.
So thank you all for staying with us. We are now entering the third panel, which will be dealing with a very important aspect related to the death penalty, which is people. We will be talking on the human consequences of death penalty, and we will be analyzing it also from a sociological perspective. And for this, we are privileged to have with us two very special guests. First, let me introduce myself. I am the Deputy Permanent Representative. I have been dealing with the death penalty thoroughly together here with colleagues in the OSCE as chef de file for the death penalty. And the idea of this panel is that we will go in depth indeed into this human aspect, and we will be having with us Ellen Prejan and Dr. Michael Radway. Ellen Prejan, I will read some, information of on her. Sister Helen, you don't need presentation. Sister Helen is a Roman Catholic sister and a leading American advocate for the abolition of the death penalty. Sister Helen is known for her best-selling book, Dead Man Walking, based on her experience with two convicts on death row, for whom she served as spiritual advisor and accompanied them to their execution in the electric chair. The book was adapted as a 1995 Academy Award-winning film of the same name, starring Susan Sarandon and Sean Penn. Since then, Sister Ellen Prejan has ministered to other inmates on death row and witnessed several more executions. The experience gave her greater insight into the process involved in executions for the convict, families, and others in the prison. Sister Ellen's second book, The Death of Innocence, an eyewitness account of wrongful executions, tests the moral edge of the debate on capital punishment. In 2019, she wrote a memoir titled River of Fire on becoming an activist. In it, she talks about the transformative challenges of the Catholic Church and about her own spiritual journey to the killing chamber that would forever change her life. Sister Ellen, you have the screen.
Thank you. What an honor to be here with all of you. Thank you, Portugal. Thank you, Carlos Brito, that did so much organizing. Thank you, our European colleagues. I have to tell you, when I first began this journey in the whole effort to wake up people to abolish the death penalty, you have been of tremendous support to me personally. The people of Italy, San Egidio, our efforts together. We need each other. And I just want to emphasize how special it is to be with you today. Changing hearts and minds has been, I guess, at the core of what I have gotten thrown into and have been called to do. In River of Fire and talking about my journey to become an activist, I had two bubbles I had to break out of. And I can identify a lot with the American public because I didn't know or think about the death penalty or penal reform. I was in my own life in the suburbs, doing good things, being nice to people around me. I had to break out of a spiritual bubble that basically directed that God, it was God, you pray, God takes care of people. The problems are too big for us humans. And I'm apolitical. I'm not getting involved in the political stuff. And then I also had to break out of the whole thing of being a part of white privilege in the suburbs, where in my city of New Orleans, the majority of people, African Americans, struggling under poverty and racism. But I was not awake. And if you're not awake, it doesn't exist for you and you can't get engaged. In the prelude that's in River of Fire, it was the witnessing of an execution that set me on fire. And I wrote the prelude like this. And it was the killing of the first man, Patrick Saunier. They killed a man with fire one night. They strapped him in a wooden chair and pumped electricity through his body until he was dead. His killing was a legal act because he had killed. No religious leaders protested the killing that night, but I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And what I saw set my soul on fire a fire that burns in me still. And now here's an account of how I came to be in the killing chamber that night. Hearts and minds. First, I myself had to wake up. And I was in my 40s before I recognized that I broke out of both bubbles, moved into the neighborhood with my African-American neighbors for the first time as a white woman in Baton Rouge and in New Orleans, Louisiana, had African-American people as my peers and as my teachers who could teach me about the rules of the other country in which Black people live in America. Make no mistake about it, that the death penalty is all about the extension of the fears of white people when slaves were freed. The whole penal system with the death penalty as the apex comes out of that experience. We are presently witnessing in our country an awakening, the likes of which we have not ever had, I think, with the killing of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter, the whole awakening, and of white people, white privileged people, awakening to the fact that race matters in everything. It's just the beginning. We have a long way to go, but nowhere more do you see it with the death penalty. When Tim Robbins was working on the movie of Dead Man Walking, based on my book, he had this little refrain and he kept saying, "The nun is in over her head." And indeed I was. So from living with poor, struggling African Americans, I get an invitation to write a man on death row. This was in the early 80s. We hadn't had an execution in Louisiana in 20 years. There'd been an unofficial moratorium from the 60s through the 70s. I hadn't even noticed that the Supreme Court had put the death penalty back in 1976. I think I'm going to be writing letters to someone on death row. I had no idea that by saying yes to being his spiritual advisor, when he's killed in the electric chair 2.5 years later, I will be there to witness it. I think if I had known that that was what was waiting for me at the end of the road, I'm not sure I could have said yes, but I believe the Lord of life works with us gradually and we take things step by step. First of all, it was the meeting of the man who was writing the letters. I had never been in the presence of a known murderer before. I had 2 hours with him, and I have to tell you in honesty, I was very afraid because I kept thinking, well, anybody can write nice letters, but what are we going to actually say to each other? What will his face even look like? Like if you're a murderer, don't you look mean? And when the guards brought him in and locked him in, and there was a heavy mesh screen between us, and I looked into his eyes, and he was smiling, and he said, "Thank you, sister. You made that long drive just to see me." I went, "Oh my God, he's a human being. He is human." And the journey began. Then to the execution. And then coming out of that execution chamber that night, and here we're moving into hearts and minds of the people. My own heart and mind had been changed. It was in the middle of the night. The first thing I did was I vomited. I had never watched a protocol in which step by step an alive human being was taken and killed in front of my eyes. And that night, it was early in the morning of April 5th, 1984, standing there in the darkness outside those prison gates, that my mission was born. A moral imperative in me because I had been a witness. You have to understand how secret the death penalty is in the United States. And as the saying goes in Latin America, what the eye does not see, the heart cannot feel. So people don't see executions. There have been at least 2 court cases to try to make executions public, but they've been defeated. Secrecy is essential to keeping it in place. And I've been thrown in now as a witness. And that moral imperative that was in me, that has kept me to this day and fresh in energy to do it, because I know I've been one of the few witnesses. And what would I do? I didn't know. I was in over my head, but I knew this. I had been a witness, and my job was going to be to tell the story to the people and to bring them there through story. And so first I just gave talks, and then I wrote the book Dead Man Walking. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the construction of the journey in Dead Man Walking, because I had this excellent editor at Random House, Jason Epstein. If I hadn't had him as the editor to help me craft the journey in Dead Man Walking, nobody would have read my book. There wouldn't have been a film or an opera. Because in the beginning, I was so into the human rights of Patrick Sonnier and why the state shouldn't be killing him. I spent the whole first part of the book with those arguments. And Jason looks at that first draft of Dead Man Walking and he said, you wait too long before you deal with the crime. In the first 10 pages of this book, if you don't talk about that Patrick Sonnier and his brother in cold blood killed 2 teenage kids, shot them in the back of the head and left them dead in a sugarcane field, nobody is going to read your book. I went back and I reshaped, because the starting point of the journey, and when we're talking hearts and minds of the American people or any people, we do have to stand before the horror and the outrage that happens in us when innocent people are killed. That's the starting point. And without that, every other argument we make, deterrence or whatever, people have to know that we too share that outrage, and we have to communicate it in some way. And so because of that great editor and because of the way the book was shaped, to take people over into both sides of the suffering, the victim's family suffering, and then the person to be executed. And Jason explained to me, your job in writing this book is going to be to take your readers with you, first at the atrocity of the killing of those 2 kids, and take them step by step with you into that execution chamber, so then they can see the execution. I didn't know the power of a book. I come from Louisiana. We're very oral culture. We love to talk to each other. But when people read a book, they're silent. They're not debating and using imagination. And that's what Dead Man Walking did. It came out in 93. It was made paperback in 94. Susan Sarandon read it. She's the one who really made the film happen. She pestered her partner, Tim Robbins, for 9 months. Did you read the Nun's book? Did you read the Nun's book? Probably for domestic tranquility, he read the book. He said it was the easiest screenplay he ever wrote. And the first thing he explained to me was the difference between art and propaganda. So he says, I'm against the death penalty with every DNA molecule in my body. But we must construct a film to help the American public get in touch with the deep ambivalence people have that's in their hearts. Surface support, yeah, I'm for the death penalty. But we have to bring them on that journey, and we have to bring them over to both sides. The boldest thing he did in the film of Dead Man Walking is that you trace the journey of Matthew Poncelet, a composite character, the first 2 people I was with on death row. Trace his journey, at first not acknowledging that he had participated in the rape and murder, then finally acknowledging it, remorse, and we see him being executed. And that final scene, it's a little code at the end, but the final scene, you see Matthew Poncelet, justice is done, he's being executed, and then Tim juxtaposes it with an aerial view of the murder, side by side, the execution and the murder. And the theater managers told Tim that they had never shown a film where people just stayed seated till the screen went blank and filed out in silence because they were thinking. That's what art does. And so when the book came out, the film came out, I have spent my time talking to the American people. And there is nothing like saying to people, let me tell you what happened to me, and taking them through. Sometimes if I'm in a room of a gymnasium of 1,000 young men in a high school with all that testosterone going in there. And I know how they start with their arguments, not exclusively, of course. I'm kind of stereotyping a little bit, but I'll start with all the arguments for the death penalty, every one that you hear. And when you start with people's own arguments, they know you understand where they're coming from. And then they're more open. The soil's tilled then to maybe hear an argument about why that's not true. There's been so much to understand. I had everything to learn about the legal system. I didn't know about the courts. I was like most Americans say, we got the best court system in the world. And if they would happen to make a mistake at trial, well, look, we have the appeals. In Death of Innocence, I talk about how it's almost impossible for a poor person who can finally get DNA evidence, but that the appeals courts cut them off and they can never get the truth told. And that constitutional rights that are supposedly yours are only there on paper. If you don't have an actual lawyer by your side, like a Denise LaBeouf, to actualize those rights for you. And if that lawyers who are appointed to you do not raise a formal objection when something happens, an appeals court later cannot review what happened at the state court. I had to learn everything about the courts. And so as I learned, I shared. I found there was a benefit that when you write a book and people realize that in the story you're telling, you don't know what you're doing either, they maybe more easily learn with you. We are at a new place now. We are, in fact, little by little shutting down the death penalty. Virginia, the ex-Confederate state, shutting down the death penalty is real. And all of it happens, I believe, from the ground up. When the soil is tilled, when the people are educated, when the people awaken, then there's not a strong political will anymore because they don't have constituents saying, yeah, kill for us. This was the first presidential race we had where we had presidential candidates against the death penalty, declaring it. That's because education has been happening in the hearts and minds of the people. Lawyers doing their job like Dna LaBeouf, better defense getting in there when people come to trial. I mean, it's a fact. When you go to trial for a capital murder, if you have good defense, you are not going to get the death penalty. And that's why you never hear of rich people, no matter what they've done, of ever going to death row, because they have good defense by their side. And people had to learn all of this. We don't know this. I learned it. And then as I began sharing it with the people, in Dead Man Walking, I tell everybody's story. The guard, Sergeant Cootie, who called me into his office. He had been the supervisor on death row, but then he had been brought in on the execution team. And I walk in his office and he said, sister, I'm gonna have to quit this job. He said, I've been to 5 of these executions and I come home afterwards, I can't sleep and I can't eat. It's interesting, I think, that's what's happening in Louisiana. We haven't had an actual execution in 18 years. And nothing's changed on the books. It's the statute still written in the Louisiana statute book. But in fact, we're not doing it. And Amnesty International has pointed this out. The first thing that changes is the practice. Finally, you change what's on the books. So I tell the story in Dead Man Walking of the death row inmate. I tell the story of the victims' families, of their anger, of their grief, of their trauma, and my own mistake of reaching out to them much later. I should have reached out to them sooner, but I was afraid of their anger. And I tell the story of the guards, and I tell the story of the governor, and I tell the story of everybody, including the saddest, unspeakable funerals I have ever been to in my life. There's a family when people are executed. They're brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers. And funerals where they're trying to have the burial and keep the press away to avoid the sensationalism of, oh, let's go get a photo of that mother grieving that executed murder that they're burying today. On the other side, I want to say about the media, The media has come on our side on the death penalty issue. Story after story of death row inmates found to be exonerated. There's a whole series on CNN, Death Row Stories, and that's had an impact on the public. When we went into this, we thought we had the best court system in the world, and it would be a fluke if we ever executed or put an innocent person on death row. There's a group in the United States called Witness to Innocence, and they are all people who were put on death row. And now they're coming out and they are witnessing and telling their stories of how it could happen, that here's a person who's never even gotten a traffic ticket and could suddenly find themselves on death row because the whole system is so broken. And so I spend time taking people into what does the Constitution say? We, the people, are the ultimate guardians of our Constitution. And when it's not being lived out, it's us, the people, that have to call the politicians to account. And finally, even the Supreme Court. We do not have members of our Supreme Court at this point that can look at that word cruel punishment and not acknowledge that to take a conscious, imaginative human being, condemn them to death and put them in a small cell for 20 years. Every person I've accompanied to execution, and there have been 6, all have the same nightmare. It's the psychological torture Denis LeBoeuf referred to. Oh, they're coming for me. It's my time. And they're taking me out, and they're dragging me out, and I'm going, no, no. And then I wake up and I'm in my cell. It was a dream, but they are going to come for me. And then the watching as your fellow prisoners are led in front of your cell when they're taken out to be killed, as Joseph Odell in Virginia watched as 20 people were led to execution before him. You have to take people there, have to take them into the human anguish, to know in your own imagination and to relive it 1,000 times before it happens. I want to say a word about the continued dialogue that happened that helped my Catholic Church reach a position of unequivocal opposition to the death penalty. For a long time upheld the right of the state to take life. And as long as you have the right of the state to take life, and give that discretion over to prosecutors, you're going to have killing. And the heart of the dialogue that I had with Pope John Paul II was, I took him in story with me. I said, Your Holiness, I keep meeting Catholics who say they're pro-life, but when it comes to the death penalty, they draw a line. If people are guilty, they should be executed. Does the church only uphold the dignity of innocent life? When I'm walking with a man to execution, he's shackled hand and foot, and he has 6 guards around him, and he's walking to his death, and he turns to me, and he says, Sister, please pray God holds up my legs when I make this walk. Where is the dignity in rendering a human being defenseless and taking his life? We have a way to defend society. We have prisons. And what happens in social movements is consciousness changes. As conscience kicks in, the change happens. We're seeing the change. It can't happen soon enough. We need your continued cooperation with us. We need your inspiration. I remember in the beginning when I first thought, how in the world are we going to convince our people that we need to change this? And then I was in the presence of people from Europe. I was in the presence of people in Italy. And it gives you hope because you see, wait, other countries are doing it. It is possible. And it's all been around education of the people, awakening the hearts and minds of the people. And then eventually things rise to a level, and there can be this constellation that happened in Virginia. And there's also the movement in the country of Black Lives Matter and the awakening about race. supposedly the worst of the worst, but when you look at the profile, it's very simple and easy to recognize the pattern. Only poor people, and overwhelmingly those who have killed whites. The people get it and the people change. And that's what I'm really very happy to share with you today. We do it through stories. We do it through individual witnessing. We do it through putting out their solid, clear arguments about why the death penalty is about us as a society. Thank you for listening to me, and it is an honor to be in your company and to engage with you in this great work of human rights.
Thank you so much, Sister Ellen. You have highlighted very important aspects basing on your experience and mentioned some aspects that definitely will be developed by our next speaker. You have mentioned that those who are disfavored are the ones who get the death penalty. Them without the capital get the punishment. I would now introduce Dr. Michael Radway. Michael Radway is a professor of society at the University of Colorado in Boulder, Colorado. For the past 40 years, Radway's research has focused on a wide array of issues related to the death penalty. Before his work at the University of Colorado Boulder, Radway worked as professor and the chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Florida. After 22 years at the University of Florida, Radway moved to Colorado in 2001, where he also served a 5-year term as chair of the Sociology Department. Professor Radway has uncovered many facts and statistics related to the problem of racial disparities in the federal death penalty. He co-authored In Spite of Innocence, a study on the ordeal of 400 Americans wrongly convicted of crimes punishable by death, and edited Facing the Death Penalty, an in-depth examination of what life under a sentence of death is like for condemned inmates and their families. His latest book outlined the history of the death penalty in Colorado, a state that successfully abolished the death penalty just last year. Radway has also worked closely with death row inmates and their families. And while in Florida, he went through last visits with 50 men in the hours before they were put to death. Throughout his career, Dr. Radway has studied the impact that the death penalty has on the mind and on society. Dr. Radway, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here this morning, or I guess this afternoon, or maybe it's tonight. I don't know. But I feel like I'm a soldier in the trenches reporting to the generals, because it's really the leaders of the worldwide abolition movement that come from Europe. And we look to you for direction and look to you for ideas, look for you for support when we do our work with the individuals who are on death row. I also want to thank Carlos Brito, of course, for his dogged help in organizing today's session. I'm especially delighted to join the panel today because it's led by Portugal, which is one of the world leaders in abolishing the death penalty. I was raised in the state of Michigan. It's the state that looks like this. And Michigan abolished the death penalty in 1847, the first English-speaking jurisdiction in the world to abolish the death penalty. So we look to Michigan and Portugal as people leading the way in the movement towards abolition. And that movement towards abolition is really moving at an incredibly rapid pace. If we step back and take a minute and look at the bigger picture, in 1977, Amnesty International reports there were only 16 countries worldwide that had abolished the death penalty. As of December 31st, 2020, there were 108 countries that were totally abolitionist, 7 that were abolitionists for ordinary crimes, and 30 that had not carried out an execution in more than 10 years. That's a total of 144 plus Malawi last week And so it's really at a very rapid pace in the last 35 or 40 years or 45 years that we've been abolishing the death penalty. Here in the United States, the number of executions dropped from 98 in 1999 to 17 last year, and only 7 of those 17 were carried out by the authority of a state government. The rest were carried out by the federal courts. Today, it looks like we have a very good chance of never seeing another federal execution ever under the leadership of President Biden. There have only been 2 executions under state authority in the United States in the past year. Nobody saw that coming. Nobody would have predicted that just a few years ago. No executions under state authority so far in 2001. So it really has been a rapid pace, both in the United States and worldwide, that the death penalty is being abolished. Individual states in the United States have also shown progress towards abolition. This despite the fact that we have a horrible Supreme Court and every one of the justices is a supporter of the death penalty. Since 1977, there have been 12 states that have abolished the death penalty, most recently Virginia in 2001. My own home state of Colorado abolished the death penalty last year. You no doubt know that 2 months ago we had 10 people were murdered in a grocery store just a mile from where I live here in Boulder. And I was down there last night. There's a big fence around the parking lot there. The park probably takes 20 minutes to walk around that fence. It's a huge parking lot, and it's covered with signs and candles and other notes from around the world expressing grief at those murders. It's astonishing to note that even though Colorado just got rid of the death penalty last year, there's not a single sign on that fence that says "kill the killer," that defendant should have been executed, that mass murders are what happened when we abolished the death penalty. Instead, a fair number of those signs talk about the need for mental health care for people who are experiencing the first symptoms of criminal violence, and other signs, a lot of signs, saying we should get rid of guns. That's a big problem here in the United States. Point here is that this is a one-way street. Once the death penalty is abolished, it's not coming back. And again, nobody's talking about the death penalty for the King Soopers killer. Public opinion in the United States is also changing rapidly. Probably in the last 15 years, public opinion on the death penalty has changed more than public opinion on any issue that we debate, with the possible exception of issues related to LGBTQ rights. Support for the death penalty has fallen from 80% in 1994 to 55% today. And again, that is really fast change in public opinion. Given the possibility of life without parole, only 36% of Americans support the death penalty. I do look forward to a conference in a few years where we can start to talk about getting rid of life without parole. As I'm sure you all know, public opinion in the United States can be kind of strange. The majority of Republicans in the United States today believe that Trump really won the 2020 election. So we have to take this public opinion with a grain of salt. But the fact is that support for the death penalty is falling like a rock. There's a number of reasons for that. Several have been mentioned today. I'm a researcher, and I think one of the chief reasons why the death penalty is falling out of favor worldwide in the United States is because of empirical research that's being done by legal scholars and social scientists around the world. One thing that we've seen that's had dramatic effects is that today virtually nobody is arguing the death penalty has a deterrent effect. 20, 30 years ago, that was the #1 reason for. I don't like to kill people, but frankly, we need to do it to reduce the homicide rate. Now that research has been conducted by numerous researchers using different data sets, different states, different methodologies. And it all comes to the same conclusion that the death penalty is not a stronger deterrent than long imprisonment. In 2012, the National Academy of Sciences released a major report coming to that conclusion, and that was the final nail, I think, in the deterrence argument. If you want to stop people from sitting on your stove, medium heat works just as well as high heat. A second issue that's had dramatic impact on opinion in the United States, as Sister Helen mentioned, is the innocence argument. There have now been 185 inmates released from America's death row since 1972, when it was discovered that they were innocent. And these are not people who we think were innocent. These are people where the state admitted that the person indeed was innocent. There's an organization, Helen briefly mentioned it, Witness to Innocence. She didn't mention that she was one of the co-founders of that organization, but Witness to Innocence is the group of those 185 exonerees. And with the help of the European Union, which I think now is the biggest funder in the world for abolitionist efforts, they certainly have funded Witness to Innocence. And the result is that schools, churches, civic groups, and prosecutors' offices can have at their disposal one of the exonerees who will come to their offices or classrooms and speak about their experience on death row. It's been tremendously effective as a way to change public opinion. 185, that means basically for every 9 executions in the United States, we discover that one person who has been on death row is innocent. And it's not only the people who are legally and factually innocent. Innocence also includes cases where the murder was an accident or the murder was done by somebody who should have been found insane, and people who are sent to death row because they have lousy attorneys. They're not necessarily the worst of the worst. We've also been talking more in the United States here about what I call the feminization of death penalty victimization, looking at women who are disproportionately, can be disproportionately victims. The death penalty punishes people like a shotgun, an ever-widening circle of tragedy, not a rifle. It doesn't just get the perpetrator, it gets his or her family. And having gone through these long visits, these last visits with inmates, again and again, I've seen where the inmate will say, oh, don't worry about me, I'm getting out of here, and the best I can hope for is life without parole. But going out of the prison with a wife, children, again, most of the family members are female, so that increases the feminization of death row. That's another example of innocent people who are affected by the death penalty. Another major reason for the decline in death penalty support is the role of churches. And here again, my hat, I don't wear a hat, but my hat goes off to Sister Helen. That book, Dead Men Walking, is the most important death penalty book published in the history of the United States. And when Helen goes and speaks around the country, around the world on the death penalty, there's always a stack of books, not only Dead Men Walking, but her other books that are available for people to purchase. And people read the book. And once they hear Helen, that's an invitation to read the book. And it's opened up doors to all sorts of communities that in 1980 supported the death penalty. I remember debating priests, Catholic priests, who were for the death penalty back in the olden days. But now all that has changed in large part because of that book, Dead Man Walking. A final factor that I'll mention, because I can't overemphasize it, is the role of international communities in fueling anti-death penalty sentiment in the United States. It's not only this group who we're speaking to today, the ICADP based in Madrid, Death Penalty Project in London. We had Raphael on here, Ecpm. Hey everybody, see you in Berlin next year. Those are only a few examples of the tremendous work being done and really to build a community of abolitionists around the world. Again, thinking back to my experiences of leaving prisons at 1 o'clock in the morning where the inmate's going to be executed 6 hours later, there's a feeling, as you can imagine, that we are alone. That if people really knew what was going on, they would never support the death penalty. And it is this organization and counterparts around the world that are shedding light on the death penalty, that are funding research so that we can uncover the disparities in death sentencing and the fact that the death penalty doesn't accomplish anything, that really are fueling our anti-death penalty movement, death penalty progress here in the United States. It's a long, battle, but I've got the feeling, I've been involved in this for almost 45 years, that we've made progress that people never imagined that we'd be making back in the 1970s. So, I think the future is bright. I thank you for your leadership and look forward to entertaining questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Radway, and thank you to all the speakers. We have encouraged you to come forward with questions. We understand that it is difficult when we have such impressive statements to come with questions. I would see if there are some questions that we have had so far. Maybe I would then kick off and ask you 2 questions, and if you have other questions, just signal it in the chat, and then we could go into a second round from replies. So, Dr. Radway, I would ask you one question. You are the author of In Spite of Innocent, an impressive account of the wrongful conviction of 400 Americans for crimes punishable by death. You have also researched factual content in support for The Death of Innocence, Sister Ellen Prejean's second book, in which she tells the story of Dobie Gillies Williams and Joseph Udell, who were both executed despite clear evidence pointing out to their innocence. My question to you is, why are innocent people executed? And my second question, which would be more directed to Sister Ellen. Sister Ellen, in your book, Dead Man Walking, you describe in detail your relation with the Burkes and the Leblanc, their suffering, and the way they experienced the execution of Patrick Saunier for the murder of their teenage children. Capital punishment creates more victims in the families of the condemned to death punishment. The family of the executed experiences severe psychological trauma and must cope with the knowledge that their relatives' deaths are actively desired and the stigma of an execution by the state. What is the impact of death penalty on family members? And these would be my 2 questions, which I leave for your reflection. And I would perhaps pass the floor first to Dr. Radway and then to Sister Ellen with these 2 questions, and encourage you to put further questions. Perhaps they would be in reaction to what will be now said. So without further ado, Dr. Radway, would you like to reply? And then Sister Ellen, you are most welcome.
Yes, thank you. Please remember I'm a college professor, so in the next 4 hours, I would like to answer that question, and that will be followed by an exam. In any event, it's very complicated. In the 1980s, nobody was arguing that innocent people were executed. We thought we had the best criminal justice system in the world, and everybody sent to death row was guilty. We did a study, we began our research in the early 1980s, I did it with Professor Hugo Adam Bedau, B-E-D-A-U, who is the top death penalty scholar in the 20th century. And we collected these stories of people who were convicted and sentenced to death. And then again, the state admitted that they were innocent. And we had about 400 cases that we first published in Stanford Law Review and then later in a book. And when that article came out in Stanford Law Review in 1985, that was pre-DNA. The first DNA exoneration was 2001. I'm sorry, was 1991. The reaction to that from really the Attorney General of the United States, the Justice Department prepared a critique of our study. The reaction focused on deterrence. And the argument was basically, everything we do, innocent people die. You know, if we go out and drive a car, once in a while, innocent people die. If we go out and play soccer, football, every once in a while, somebody gets killed doing that. However, with the death penalty, they said, okay, once in a while, innocent people are killed, but the net benefits of that, of the death penalty in deterrence outweigh that liability. So the justification for erroneous executions, erroneous convictions, has evaporated with the deterrence argument. Another thing that happens with the innocence argument is that probably only about 20% of homicides have DNA residue that can be tested. There are many examples of people being exonerated because of DNA, but if it's a drive-by shooting or somebody runs into a store with a gun and kills somebody, there's no DNA left to analyze. The people who are exonerated, when you read these stories, are just incredibly lucky. It's hard to say, hey, you know, some of these people in witness to innocence have spent 30 or 40 years on death row, and they come out there saying that they're lucky, but indeed they are lucky because things like a previously silent eyewitness comes forward, or somebody admits that they perjured themselves at trial, or in some cases it's a person like Dna Leblanc who sticks with the case. They're lucky to have a lawyer like that. So the role of Lady Luck is especially impressive in the stories of those 185 people who have been released from death row. And that, you know, again, thanks to European Union funding, those stories get out, and it's had dramatic impact on death penalty opinion. Sister Helen?
About the victims' families. Such an incredible thing. I got plunged into all this, had never encountered such violence and sorrow. And victims' families go through a lot. The story that I can tell in some depth in Dead Man Walking is about Lloyd Leblanc, whose son David, 17, goes to a football game on a Friday night, and his father never sees him alive again. He's called to identify his boy in the morgue. His journey is really a journey I like. I call him the hero of Dead Man Walking, because the journey he had to make was first that he was in trauma, that he was in grief, and the anger almost consumed him of how he wanted to kill the people who killed his boy. And the turning point for him, the conversion point, the transformative point, he helped me understand the word even forgive. It means to give before, to not let the love of your own life be changed so that he became changed. And the way he put it to me was, I've always been a kind person, and I was so consumed with anger that I was losing who I was. He put his hand out like this at one point, and he just said, they killed my boy, but I'm not going to let them kill me. Victims' families are the most vulnerable of people. And where you have prosecutors that want to go for the death penalty, and again, we can't emphasize enough, you don't have a death penalty if you don't have a prosecutor who pursues death. They have a choice from square one not to pursue death. And often politicians have used victims' families because they want them sitting in that courtroom. They want them, when they make their closing argument to the jury, do justice for this victim's families. But more and more stories have come out from victims, especially like when New Jersey did away with the death penalty in 2011. 62 murder victims' families testified before the legislature, don't kill for us. The death penalty just re-victimizes us. We wait and wait and wait in this holding posture, our grief very public. And some of them just explicitly said, do you really think that you're going to give me a front row seat while you kill the one who killed my loved one, and that's supposed to heal me or give me anything that, the word you use, closure? So their own witness to us Plus, it's been very dramatic that almost all of the victims' families that we're talking about are white families. Black people are killed. When I lived in St. Thomas in the inner city, Virginia Carr had 2 sons killed, African-American, 2 sons killed within 6 months, and they weren't even investigated. So it's such a tilt, the bias, the race bias is in it so much. So victims' families also, I think, by their testifying, just like on the other side, exonerees, by their just saying the death penalty doesn't help heal us, is really helping us as well.
Thank you, Sister Ellen. I don't see that we have requests for questions. So therefore, it is up to me to thank you so much for your contribution to this panel. There is definitely much more to be discussed. It's about human life. And we therefore are very grateful that you have shared with us your very rich experiences. We will now close this panel and move into the closing session. I would ask you to stay tuned. Very shortly, we will have the closing session. Thank you.
Call Mike Radlett.
Your iPhone's in airplane mode.
Helen, mute.
So we come now to the final part of our event. I believe we had a high quality discussion on some of the most important issues regarding the death penalty from a technical and legal point of view, while at the same time we had the opportunity to have a deep understanding of its impact on the human condition. And we are grateful for the expressions of recognition of the support of the European Union, the European institutions, the European instruments, to the civic organizations that in different parts of the world, including the participating states of OSCE, have a concrete action against death penalty. That remark by Professor Radway, it was very important to be made and recalled here today. Well, I will not try to summarize the discussion, as this will be done by Mrs. Marta Santos Pais, member of the International Commission Against Death Penalty, that previously was special representative of at UN for the rights of children, and a very good friend of mine. And Marta, please, you have the screen.
Many thanks. I'm sure you will feel as inspired and excited as I do after having listened to this excellent debate and the wonderful and inspiring contributions and emotional contributions of each and every of the participants. We are coming towards the end of this very good conference, and I wanted just to highlight some of the points that have come from the discussion. And would like to start by recognizing that, of course, the conference was held as a reaffirmation of the commitment, long commitment of Portugal, as it has been recognized, towards the abolition of the death penalty, but also in support of the high priority that has been given by the European Union to this question, as recently informed by the Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, and by the important policy and normative framework developed throughout the years by the Council of Europe and supported by the case law of the European Court on Human Rights. As we have heard, all share a very deep commitment to building, to consolidating a Europe as a death penalty free continent, and to continue to work with many other actors to promote a global movement and a global reality of abolition of this cruel punishment. As it was highlighted, the abolition of the death penalty is anchored as a fundamental dimension of the European acquis. And it has been recognized that it is so because of the tradition in the content, but because it is recognized as being unnecessary, irreversible, contrary to the human dignity and to fundamental human rights standards that have been widely recognized in the world. And of course, we also heard, and we are very happy to be supported equally in this conference by the important experience by OSCE, and very especially by the human dimension implementation meetings and agenda of this organization. As we have heard, there have been many important commitments expressed by OSCE participating states, and today again we heard several of them taking the floor. And the annual background paper that is prepared by the organization is a wonderful resource for all of us to find inspiration and continue to advance this important cause. There were so many important principles that were recognized in the first session, and of course, no intention to replicate all of them. But I think it's always good to recall the reaffirmation of the absolute opposition by the European Union and the Council of Europe to the death penalty at all times and in all circumstances, and the recognition that execution does not bring less violence to society, which is very often a myth, as we have heard. We have also heard that lack of information on the use of the death penalty, and this was a topic that became quite systematic throughout the day, the lack of information on the use of the death penalty, in fact, compromises not only public scrutiny, but the ability to instill and to support the public debate that we so dramatically need to try, as Sister Ellen Bridget was telling us a moment ago, so that we can touch not only the minds, but the hearts of people, creating and enhancing the understanding of what we are talking about. And I think this important starting of the conference comes at a very momentous occasion in the world when, as we have heard, so many examples, there is a wonderful trend towards global progress, towards the abolition of the death penalty. I'm going to recall some of the elements that were mentioned during our conference. First of all, the widening adherence to international standards towards the abolition of the death penalty. As we heard, most of European countries are today parties to both protocols to the European Convention on Human Rights, and we have today 89 states that have ratified the second protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights on the abolition of the death penalty, Armenia having been the most recent last March. And as we heard in a very encouraging manner, in Kazakhstan, important steps have been taken with the adoption of the national law towards the ratification of this protocol to the covenant, which was unanimously endorsed by the parliament, and the fact that the president has signed early this year this national law so that the country becomes a party to the covenant. And as we also heard, of course, Kazakhstan is playing a very important role in creating a Central Asia death penalty free region, and we will all continue to work closely to make it, to translate it into a very important reality. The second important progress that was noted is the fact that we have today a large majority of states in the world who are abolitionists. Just a few days ago, in fact, in another region, the Constitutional Court of Malawi decided to outlaw the death penalty and order the resentencing of all convicts facing execution in the country. And as we heard, there have been important and promising developments in the United States. Certainly, the fact that Virginia became the 23rd abolitionist state after Colorado, as we have heard, with great pride. But it's good to recall that over the the last 4 years, 4 states have in fact adhered to this movement. And we know of many important developments that are taking shape in the country and that we hope will materialize soon to widen this important movement. And of course, we were extremely encouraged by the announcement, by the recall of the important expression of commitment to this cause by the Biden administration before the Human Rights Office of the United Nations to end death penalty at the federal level, and the encouragement for the same approach to be followed at the state level in the country. I think here I would like to recall another important message that Sister Ellen Presian has underscored. The US seems to be shutting the death penalty, and we hope to see it happening very, very soon, of course. The third dimension of the progress we note around the world is the movement towards a moratorium on the use of the death penalty as a first step towards abolition. And of course, we know that within the OSCE region, Kazakhstan, the Russian Federation, and Tajikistan have maintained this important long-term moratoria. But it's also very important to recall, as many of the speakers have done, the record vote that was achieved in the United Nations last December in the General Assembly on the resolution on a moratorium on the use of the death penalty. And we have still more good news. I mean, certainly, as many of you have mentioned, we have seen in 2020 an increasing trend towards the number of commutation of death sentences and a decrease in the number of executions, which has reached, as some have recalled, the lowest number over the last decade. And I think in this regard, I would like to recall, of course, the important message that in Belarus, there was very recently, just last week, a decision by the president to grant a commutation of 2 death sentences to 2 young brothers who were in fact in the death row. And of course, this is a very important step, and we hope that it will be further advanced in the country in a more systematic manner. We also saw, as we heard, the reinforcement of the normative framework within Europe, for instance, with the adoption of the recommendation of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe in relation to the measures against the trade in goods used for the death penalty, which is, of course, something that the European Union has been pursuing for a number of years, but which has an impact in so many countries. We heard a few references in relation to the United States for the use of untested drugs, as we know, and in fact, the movement by some of the pharmaceutical manufacturers to support some resistance to this risk. And the final progress dimension that I would like to recall that was also mentioned is the fact that the International Commission Against the Death Penalty, of which I am honored to be a member, has been awarded the prize of the Council of Europe Center North-South exactly for its work in mobilizing support towards the abolition of the death penalty around the world. So we have an irrevocable path towards the eradication of this cruel, inhuman punishment, and we need to consolidate it and advance it vigorously, of course, and that needs work from all of us, as we have heard. But we cannot look at this reality with complacency because, as we have heard, there are so many persisting challenges that we need to address, and we cannot forget them. And I think we have heard throughout our sessions, I'll recall some of them. In some countries, executions have resumed. In some countries, they have increased. We have, unfortunately, some cases of persons with psychological disabilities who have been sentenced to death. We have young people who have been executed. We have women who have been executed, and we have women who are under a death sentence. And of course, these are indications that our work needs to continue, and no doubt the good examples of this conference will help us to do it in a more vigorous and more effective manner. I didn't hear any reference to the pandemic, but I want just very briefly to recall that we cannot forget how COVID-19 has had an impact on so many of the people in the death row. First of all, because in so many countries, there has been a suspension of the visits by family members and also by their legal representatives, because the executions have been postponed without any very concrete indication of the date. And all of that adds to the uncertainty and the cruelty of this situation, of course, that those in a death row certainly are dramatically impacted by, and their families, as we heard in the last session, are certainly suffering immensely as a result. Now, afterwards, we heard in a very interesting way two very different examples of two countries where there are developments and there are concerns. And I think it is very important to recall how these national experiences and the sharing of information can help us clarify better what are the persisting challenges, and at the same time feel encouraged and stimulated by the good developments that gives us encouragement to move in the best direction. And amongst the concerns that were mentioned, of course, I think the question of secrecy, the secrecy of the execution, is something that persists as a very challenging dimension when we address this cause. And as we know, it is so important to not to compromise the right to be protected from torture, to know what is the date of the execution, what is the place foreseen for the execution, what is the burial place if a body has been buried as a result of an execution. But above all, of course, how can the secrecy be subject to public scrutiny so that executions are not carried out and we manage to prevent another loss of life. And this will be very important to supporting national and international debate. We also heard about other challenges that are associated with the stigma that surrounds people who are facing the death penalty and their families, as we also heard. The issue of racism that so often is associated with this situation. As we heard, and Dna above mentioned so many important things, but one of the things that was very striking to me was trials are infected by racism. And this is something that, of course, we need to challenge and we need to pay attention to so that we don't let it go with complacency, as we know. Of course, families and children within families are dramatically impacted by all these situations, as we have heard. And in a way, I think one of the conclusions was, if we want to address all these issues, we cannot be limited. I'm a lawyer myself also. We cannot be limited to reforming the legal system. We need to go beyond. And we have great examples in our panelists, of course, beyond lawyers, as some of us are. And this will help to ensure the safeguard of fundamental standards that have been endorsed by the international community, starting with a fair trial, the opportunity to prepare with due time and support the defense, to have access to the needed documents, to have the right to exercise an appeal, to present a petition, to seek pardon, and to be given the right attention that that requires, so that we make sure that, in fact, the criminal justice system is not about revenge, but it is about justice, delivering justice, and moving forward in creating the best possible society for all of us. We also heard very important aspects relating to the question of how the convicted are suffering, and so often in a very invisible manner to the wide public, and how the families are suffering as a result. And in this regard, I think it is so important to recall, as we heard, the importance of paying attention and to share the information about how people are suffering and how they are envisaging the situation they find themselves in. And as Sister Ellen President so often has said, we need to look and to consider the human dignity of these people and their history, but to look at them as more than just the worst thing that they have ever done in their lives, and look into what they are today and how they want to restore the harm that they have done, rather than losing their lives, putting at risk a fundamental human right standard that admits no derogation, as we have also heard. And in this regard, I think I cannot resist but mentioning very briefly, I think very often about how the children of those who are convicted to death penalty are envisaging all of this. First of all, feeling dramatically frightened, confused, because death is always traumatic for them, but because it is the public authorities who are in fact carrying out the killing of one of their parents, how they endure stigmatization, and in fact they are excluded from games in the school, the ability of learning, from assistance and care that they are entitled to, and certainly to a protected environment that each child should be benefiting from. And as we also heard, of course, we see trends that are worrying: the feminization of convicts of a death penalty, people with disabilities facing this dramatic, inhuman sentencing, and people belonging to minorities going through the same dramatic situation. So in a way, I think we can highlight on the one hand that, of course, we need to welcome, we need to celebrate and make known the good progress that we have highlighted during the discussion of today. I'm not going to repeat them, but there are too many to leave us indifferent to this. We need to feel excited, uplifted, and re-energized to move forward in our cause. We need to recall what we hear. And in this regard, I think it's important to recall what Pope Francis has recently told us when he highlighted that there is no human way of killing a person. And death penalty does not render justice to the victims, but fosters vengeance. And this is what, in fact, we want to bring to an end. So if I could highlight a few recommendations that I think came from the debate, I would start by the call that was made to the adherence, to the ratification and accession to international standards, and very especially the two protocols to the European Convention on the Abolition of the Death Penalty and the second protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Secondly, again, we need to ensure that there is respect for internationally recognized standards for the protection of the rights of persons who are facing the death penalty in each and every moment, from the moment of arrest to the moment of a pardon or commutation of their sentence or adoption of a legislative change that would put death penalty away forever. Thirdly, many of you have highlighted the importance of continuing to promote reinforced dialogue, periodic exchange of information and experiences, because it is important that people know about what it is going in the minds and the hearts of the convicted, of their families, but because people need to know about opportunities of change and the important impact of the abolition of the death penalty in countries that have either established it by law or adopted a moratorium to this end. And listening to the victims and to their family members is something that was stressed by many of you, and no doubt we need to promote it. Thirdly, in doing this promotion of information and experiences, it is, of course, very important to promote coordinated action. And I think the conference of today illustrates this well, associating naturally the Council of Europe, the European Union, OSCE, and ODIHR in particular, and so many allies from around the world who are committed to the same goal. Now, this will help do two things, in my view. On the one hand, of course, it will help to research, as we heard, to document, to make known, and promote the dissemination of positive developments and factors of progress, because we know that progress stimulates further progress, and it is a contagious movement, in fact. And this will be extremely valuable. We will build on positive developments. But similarly, this will help us to identify the persisting difficulties, challenges, evolving and emerging concerns that had not been considered previously. And to overcome this, of course, we need strong partnerships. We need broad coalitions with these alliances that so many of you have highlighted. This will help us to feel stronger, to benefit from the support of these networks, but it will also help us to provide the advice and assistance that countries that are committed to abolishing the death penalty can seek and benefit from, to establish a moratorium and to, in fact, introduce a legal reform to abolish death penalty for good. So what should we do? I think no doubt we need to raise awareness about what was happening in this important conference. We need to share the news about what was shared here to foster debate, further debate, public debate in our countries, in our organizations, and doing that again, not limited to the lawyers, not only the prosecutors, not only the judges, not all the correctional officers that so often are involved in this question, but to involve the parliaments, to involve civil society, as we heard, to involve the academia, to involve human rights defenders, medical experts, and so many others that will be helping us in this important alliance that needs to continue to grow. And finally, I would like to emphasize the importance that has also been stressed, particularly in the last session, of the imperative of reinforcing and investing in further research. We need more research, we need evidence, and the decisions need to be permeated by sound evidence, and we need better data, disaggregated naturally by age, by gender, by ethnic origin, by racial origin naturally, but also by social origin that so often is stigmatized in this question. And we need to understand better how many people are in death row, how many are sentenced to death, how many commutations have taken place, and so on and so forth. That will help us to move the debate forward and reinforce democracy, in fact, by providing a very important public scrutiny of this question. So I'm very confident that what we have heard and what has inspired us throughout this conference will be kept very much alive in all the work that we will continue to do. Certainly in the International Commission Against the Death Penalty will continue to be a priority. And I'm very happy that amongst the many good things that we heard today, we heard about the International Congress in 2022 in Berlin. And no doubt we are going to speed up our efforts to have even more news, good news to bring to Berlin, but hopefully to celebrate many more news in the lead up to Berlin. So thank you so much for the opportunity of being with you and contributing to this very important debate, and all the best in all your endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Marta, for this excellent summary and the ideas for the follow-up of this conference that will subject to our reflection, and we'll keep in the OSCE this reflection going on, you can be sure, and in other forums. Now, let me give the floor for the closing remarks to His Excellency Francisco André, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Portugal. Your Excellency, Mr. Secretary of State, you have the floor, the screen.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies and distinguished panelists and participants, and ladies and gentlemen. Very good afternoon to you all. We have now come to the end of this international conference on the death penalty, and I'm very pleased to be present in this closing session. I believe this conference was a fruitful opportunity to share information and discuss the most pressing issues pertaining to the death penalty. We have exchanged views on the global state of play of the death penalty, as well as its diverse realities, practices, and perspectives in different states, covering three complementary dimensions of the subject. In the first session, we praised the role and relevance of multilateral fora, recognizing the need for coordinated action to promote the abolition of the death penalty. We also highlighted the potential for synergies between organizations such as the OSCE, the Council of Europe, and the European Union, each of them with its own added value and acquis. In session 2, we reflected on the legal and institutional aspects of the death penalty, as well as on arbitrariness of trials, inequality of sentences, wrongful convictions, and the nexus with torture. In the third session, we were moved by the testimonies of those who brought us the human and sociological impacts of capital punishment, voicing the stories and concerns of the death row inmates and their relatives. I'm sorry. During this conference, we have reiterated our firm opposition to the use of death penalty at all times and in all circumstances. We have reaffirmed our adherence to the OECE commitments and international human rights principles and standards. And we have also welcomed the growing global abolitionist trend, but we have also acknowledged the challenges worldwide. It is imperative we keep the abolition of the death penalty high on the agenda. Only through dialogue and coordinated action can we walk the path of fulfilling the OSCE commitments and international human rights principles we have set ourselves. We would like to thank you all for participating in this debate, for sharing your knowledge and your experiences, but also for raising pertinent questions. Let me finish by praising the Portuguese permanent representative to the OSCE and his team, of course, for organizing this successful event. And I'd like to finish saying that this month of May brings us auspicious reasons and a fresh impetus to celebrate next October the World and European Day Against the Death Penalty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your words, Mr. Secretary of State. Excellencies, ambassadors, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your presence and active contribution for this event today. From Minsk to Boulder, Colorado. The International Conference on Death Penalty, organized by the Portuguese Presidency of the European Council of the Union, is now closed. I thank you very much and have a nice evening or day. Thank you.